Hey everyone, I'm the Midnight Truth and I'm here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to help you fall asleep, so before we begin, do me a quick favor, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel. Also, I'd love to know in comments where you're from and what time it is when you're listening. Let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's story. The first time I saw the house, it was a drizzly Monday afternoon, the kind of day where everything feels slightly gray, like the world hasn't quite woken up yet. The house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, its faded blue paint peeling like the bark of an old tree. The shutters hung unevenly, one of them swaying faintly in the breeze, and the front porch sagged under the weight of neglect. It was the last place anyone would think of as charming, but to me it was perfect. I'd signed the papers just a week earlier, my divorce finalized only a month before that. 34, alone, and trying to piece together some version of a new life. When my real estate agent called the house a gem with potential, I chuckled to myself. She meant it was cheap. I didn't care. I needed space, distance, and something I could call my own. The key felt heavy in my palm as I unlocked the front door. The hinges groaned in protest, the sound reverberating through the empty halls like a warning. I hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside, clutching my bag tightly. The air was stale, tinged with mildew and something faintly metallic, like the scent of rusted iron. I wrinkled my nose and told myself it was nothing a good cleaning wouldn't fix. The house was larger than I'd remembered. The ceilings were high, the walls painted in colors that might have been warm decades ago but now looked faded and tired. Each step I took made the wooden floors creak beneath me, the sound sharp and deliberate, like they were announcing my presence to something unseen. The living room was cavernous, with an old brick fireplace dominating one wall. Above it, a mirror hung askew, its glass warped and smudged with age. I stared at my reflection for a moment, distorted and ghostly, before I turned away. My footsteps echoed as I wandered deeper into the house, through a narrow hallway that seemed to stretch longer than it should have. The kitchen was small but functional. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting weak, yellow light over chipped counters and scuffed linoleum. I opened the cabinets one by one, finding nothing but dust and cobwebs, until I reached the last one. Inside, shoved into a corner, was an old mason jar filled with what looked like dried herbs and brittle leaves. I picked it up, the glass cool in my hand, and studied the label scrawled in faded ink. Protection. I frowned and placed it back, my skin prickling with a vague unease. I didn't have time to dwell on it. The moving truck was due to arrive within the hour, and I had plenty to unpack from my car in the meantime. I stepped outside into the damp afternoon and began unloading boxes, one after another, until my arms ached and my breath came in sharp gasps. By the time the movers finally pulled up, I was leaning against the porch railing, sipping coffee from a paper cup and watching the sky grow darker. "Nice place," one of the movers said as he carried a box past me, his voice laced with sarcasm. I forced a smile and didn't respond. It wasn't nice. It wasn't supposed to be. It was a beginning, not an ending. By the time everything was inside, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the house had taken on a different personality. The shadows seemed deeper, the corners darker, and the faint creaks and groans of the old wood carried an eerie resonance. I told myself it was just my imagination. Old houses make noise, right? It was natural. After the movers left, I spent an hour arranging the bare essentials. My bed, a lamp, and a few personal items. The rest of the boxes could wait until morning. I sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through my phone and trying to ignore the feeling that the house was watching me. I hadn't heard from anyone in days. Not my ex, not my friends, not even my mother. I told myself I liked the solitude, but the silence was heavy, like a thick blanket pressing down on my chest. That's when I heard the first noise. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like the sound of a door closing somewhere deep within the house. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat, and strained to listen. Nothing. Just the creak of the wind outside and the distant hum of traffic. I shook my head and laughed softly. "Get a grip, Anna," I whispered to myself. "It's just the house settling." Still, I double-checked the locks before I climbed into bed that night, pulling the blankets up to my chin and staring at the cracked ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard faint creaks and groans, the whisper of movement just beyond the edge of perception. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the thin curtains I had hastily hung the night before. I woke to the sound of birds chirping and the distant hum of lawnmowers, a reminder that despite my unease, the world outside was still turning. The events of the previous night seemed silly in the light of day. Old houses made noises, that was a fact. I laughed at myself for letting it get under my skin and decided to make today productive. My plan was simple: unpack, clean, and make this house feel like home. I started in the kitchen, scrubbing the counters until they gleamed and clearing out the dusty cabinets. When I reached the mason jar labeled protection, I hesitated for a moment. Something about it felt out of place, like it didn't belong in a mundane space like this. I set it on the counter, intending to toss it later, and moved on. The day passed quickly. I worked through room after room, my playlist blaring from my phone to drown out the occasional creak of the floorboards. By the time I reached the attic, the sun was already beginning to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the narrow staircase. The attic door was stiff, its hinges resisting as I pushed it open. A musty smell greeted me, thick and cloying, and I instinctively covered my nose. The room was cramped and dark, with a single bare bulb dangling from the low ceiling. I pulled the string, and the light flickered weakly before settling into a dim yellow glow. The space was filled with the remnants of the house's past lives: dusty trunks, old furniture draped in white sheets, and stacks of faded newspapers. I told myself this was normal, that every old house had its share of forgotten belongings. But as I began to sift through the clutter, a chill ran down my spine. One trunk in particular caught my attention. It was large and ornate, its dark wood etched with strange symbols that looked almost like runes. The lock was rusted, but when I tugged on it, the lid creaked open with surprising ease. Inside, I found a collection of items that sent a ripple of unease through me: a bundle of blackened candles, a tarnished silver dagger, and a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age. I sat cross-legged on the attic floor, the journal heavy in my hands. The pages were filled with spidery handwriting, the ink faded but still legible. The entries were dated, though the handwriting seemed to shift and change over time, as if several people had written in it. The first few entries were mundane enough: notes about the house's construction, its original layout, and even a list of tenants. But as I read on, the tone grew darker. One entry, dated 1902, stood out. Asterisk, the rituals are complete. The house breathes now, its spirit awakened. What we have summoned cannot be undone. Asterisk. I stared at the words, my hands trembling. It had to be a joke, I told myself. Someone's idea of a twisted story, maybe even a prank played by the previous tenants. But as I flipped through the journal, the entries became more unsettling. There were mentions of strange occurrences: shadows moving on their own, whispered voices in the dead of night, and an oppressive presence that seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. My chest tightened as I reached the final entry, dated 1937. Asterisk, the house is not ours anymore. It has claimed us, as it will claim all who come after. We leave this warning for those who follow. Do not stay. Do not let it in. Asterisk. I slammed the journal shut and shoved it back into the trunk, my heart pounding in my ears. The attic felt colder now, the air heavy and stifling. I stumbled back down the stairs, leaving the light on and the door ajar. Back in the kitchen, I tried to calm myself with a cup of tea, but my hands shook as I poured the water. I couldn't stop thinking about the journal, about the cryptic warnings and the bizarre items in the trunk. It was just a story, I told myself. Old houses have history and people love to exaggerate. That evening, as I sat on the couch with a book, the house seemed quieter than usual. The creaks and groans had stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the words in front of me, but every so often, I caught myself glancing at the doorway, half expecting someone, or something, to appear. It wasn't until I climbed into bed that the noises started again. Faint at first, a distant thump like something heavy had fallen upstairs. Then came the soft creak of floorboards, deliberate and measured, as if someone was pacing just outside my room. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it pressed against my ears. I reached for my phone, its glow illuminating the room, and checked the time: 2:13 a.m. Before I could convince myself to get up and investigate, a new sound broke the silence: the faint, rhythmic tapping of fingers against glass. It was coming from the window behind me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, and turned slowly. The curtains were drawn, but the tapping continued, soft and insistent, like a message I didn't want to hear. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I pulled back the curtain. The window was empty. Just the dark night beyond, the skeletal branches of the oak tree swaying in the wind. And yet, the tapping continued. I slammed the curtain shut and crawled back into bed, pulling the blanket over my head like a child. I didn't sleep that night. The sound didn't stop until the first rays of dawn crept through the curtains. As I lay there, my mind racing, One thought kept repeating itself over and over. What had I let in? The next morning, I barely managed to get out of bed. The sound of the tapping still echoed in my mind, playing over and over like a broken record. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe a branch scraping against the window, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The house was old, yes. It creaked, it groaned, but that tapping was different. It felt intentional. I spent the entire day trying to ignore the gnawing unease that had settled in my chest. I did my best to carry on with my normal routine, focusing on unpacking and tidying the house. The more I tried to distract myself, the more the strange events from the past few days began to surface in my thoughts. By late afternoon, I decided to go for a walk. The fresh air would help clear my head. I threw on a jacket and stepped out the front door, grateful for the momentary escape from the confines of the house. The neighborhood was quiet, a few houses spaced far apart on tree-lined streets. As I wandered, my thoughts turned back to the journal I had found in the attic. The more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't just old, it was haunted. As I walked, I found myself drawn to the house next door. It was a small, two-story home, the garden neatly manicured and the windows clean. A figure stood at the front door, a woman in her late 50s, her short gray hair cropped neatly around her face. She was watching me, her gaze piercing, and for a moment, I felt as though she could see straight through me. She smiled faintly and waved as I approached. "You must be the new neighbor," she said in a voice that was unexpectedly warm. I nodded. "Yeah, I'm Anna. Just moved in." "Good to meet you, Anna. I'm Margaret. I've been in this neighborhood for years." She extended a hand, which I took, trying not to feel too awkward. "Nice to meet you too. It's a quiet place around here." Margaret's smile faltered for a brief moment, and I couldn't help but notice the way her eyes darted toward my house. Her voice lowered slightly. "It's peaceful, yes, but some say there's a certain history to that house." I raised an eyebrow, unsure if she was just making conversation or if there was something more behind her words. "History?" Margaret seemed to hesitate, her gaze lingering on the house again before she spoke in a hushed tone. "People who've lived there, they don't tend to stay long. Some leave in a hurry, others don't leave at all." She paused, her eyes meeting mine again. "You'll hear stories. But, well," she trailed off as if unsure whether to continue. A chill ran through me and I instinctively glanced toward the house, the dark silhouette standing ominously in the distance. "Stories?" I repeated, trying to keep my voice casual. "Oh, rumors. It's just an old house. You'll hear things, footsteps when no one's there, whispers in the night. Nothing to be afraid of, though." She smiled again, but there was something tight in her expression now, as if she was trying to reassure herself as much as me. I nodded, but I could feel my stomach tighten. The tapping sound, the whispers in the night. Margaret's words felt too much like a warning, like a veil of dread that had suddenly descended over me. "Don't worry about it," Margaret added, her voice light now, though there was still a trace of something heavy in her tone. "Just make sure you lock the doors. You never know what might be lurking in an old house like that." I forced a smile, my pulse racing. "Thanks for the advice. I'll keep that in mind." As I turned to leave, I could feel her watching me, the weight of her gaze following me until I reached the end of the street. I tried to shake off the conversation, but it gnawed at me. As the evening rolled in, the house seemed to press in around me again. I busied myself with more unpacking, but my mind kept wandering back to the journal in the attic, the strange symbols, and Margaret's cryptic warning. That night, after I made a hasty dinner and watched TV for a while, I went to bed early, hoping to shake the unease that had followed me all day. I locked the doors and checked the windows once more, trying to ignore the cold drafts that seemed to creep through the walls. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it again. The tapping. I sat up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. It was coming from the window, soft, rhythmic, just like the night before. The same pattern. Tap, tap, tap. I stared at the window in the dark, my breath shallow. I couldn't move. I felt frozen, like something was holding me in place. The tapping continued, now louder, as though something was trying to get my attention. I couldn't take it anymore. I scrambled out of bed, my hands shaking, and rushed to the window. I wrenched open the curtain, half expecting to see a figure standing outside, staring in. But once again there was nothing. Just the darkness, the empty street, and the whisper of wind. I exhaled in frustration and closed the curtain, but the tapping didn't stop. It was like it was coming from inside the room now, echoing off the walls, growing louder with each passing second. I felt something shift in the air, a coldness that seemed to seep into my bones. It wasn't just the window anymore. It felt like the house itself was breathing, watching me. A sudden, sharp noise, like something heavy being dragged across the floor, came from the hallway just outside my bedroom. I froze, paralyzed with fear. I didn't move. I couldn't. The house was alive. It was trying to tell me something. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, and the tapping died down, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. I waited, breathless, for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. I stayed awake all night, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. And when morning finally came, I left the house for a few hours, driving aimlessly, trying to get away from the oppressive feeling that had settled over me. I couldn't stay away for long though. I knew I had to face it. I had to find out what was going on. And I knew deep down that the house was waiting for me to return. By the time I returned to the house, the unease had turned into something more tangible, something that I could feel crawling under my skin, making me shiver every time I stepped inside. The air felt colder than it had that morning, and the house seemed to be holding its breath, like it was waiting for something. I tried to act normal. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Old houses creaked. They groaned. The wind could make strange noises, especially at night. But the air in this house felt different, thicker somehow. And there were no explanations for the tapping, the dragging noises, the whispering. I tried to push the thought of leaving to the back of my mind. I had only just gotten settled in. There was no reason to let fear dictate my life. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to grow. The moment I walked through the door, the silence hit me like a wall. There was no comforting hum of the refrigerator, no distant sounds of traffic or birds outside. Just silence. Deep, thick silence that seemed to echo through every corner of the house. I put my keys on the entry table, took off my jacket, and sighed. I had to eat something, so I moved to the kitchen. The house creaked behind me, but I didn't look back. Not yet. As I was pulling out some food from the fridge, I heard it again. A soft thud. It came from upstairs. I froze, the knife still in my hand, half-cut vegetables lying forgotten on the counter. My heart pounded in my chest, and I instinctively held my breath, straining to listen. There it was again. Thud. It sounded like footsteps. Not a heavy stomp, but a deliberate, slow, dragging step. Someone, was up there. But I had checked every room when I moved in. I'd seen no one. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to just go up there to see for myself. But every muscle in my body tensed, as though I were being warned away. I let the knife drop onto the counter and turned to the stairs. The house seemed to stretch taller before me, its dark wooden railings winding up into the shadowy second floor. The footsteps stopped, but my pulse didn't slow. Instead, it quickened. I slowly ascended the stairs, each creak underfoot making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. When I reached the top, I stood at the landing, feeling the weight of the silence press against my ears. The hallway ahead of me seemed darker than it had before. The dim light from the hallway below barely reached the far corners of the house. I glanced down each side of the hall, trying to see any movement. Nothing. Then I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of something, or someone, scraping along the floor just beyond the closed door at the far end of the hallway. My breath caught in my throat, and without thinking, I moved toward it. The door stood partially open, its hinges creaking in protest as I nudged it farther. I half expected to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding and stepped inside. The room was dim, with dusty furniture covered in old sheets. The walls were lined with bookshelves that were barely visible in the low light. And there, in the far corner, stood a wooden chair facing away from the door. A cold draft rushed past me, sending a shiver down my spine. The room smelled musty, stale air that hadn't been disturbed in years. But there was something more now. A faint, almost imperceptible smell of burning incense. I took a step forward, and that's when I saw it. A journal, lying open on the floor beside the chair. Its pages were yellowed with age, its edges curling and fraying. The faint scent of something old and bitter clung to the pages. My curiosity got the better of me, and I knelt down, reaching for the journal. It was heavier than I'd expected, as though it were filled with something more than paper. I carefully opened the first page. The handwriting was uneven, frantic in some places, almost illegible in others. But the words were clear enough to send a chill through me. Asterisk, there is a door. It waits for you. You must let it in. It calls to you in the dark. Do not listen to the others. You will not be free until you open it. Asterisk. I turned the page, my fingers trembling. More cryptic, more terrifying. The writer described rituals, incantations, and symbols I couldn't recognize. And every few lines, the same sentence repeated. Asterisk, the house will never let you leave. It is bound to you now. The door is waiting. Asterisk. The last few pages were a blur of symbols, circles, and strange markings that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. I couldn't stop myself. I had to know more. I turned the page one last time, and there it was, an illustration of a door drawn with sharp, jagged lines that seemed to move as my eyes followed them. The door was open just a crack, and from the darkness beyond it, eyes stared back at me. My pulse quickened, and I slammed the journal shut, my mind reeling. The house had been waiting. I looked up from the journal, and the room seemed to shift. The shadows deepened, and a coldness settled around me, heavy like a weight pressing down on my chest. I wasn't alone anymore. From behind me, a faint, almost inaudible sound began. A soft whispering like voices murmuring just out of reach. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The whispering grew louder, sharper, as if the voices were coming closer. I felt something brush past my ear, cold and unsettling. The floor creaked beneath me, and I spun around to find the chair had moved. Just an inch, but enough to make my heart skip a beat. I backed away from the room, the journal still clutched in my hands. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again. The sound of dragging feet, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, breathing in the cold night air like it was my only escape. The house loomed behind me, silent now, waiting. But I knew one thing for certain. It wasn't done with me, and it wouldn't let me go. I didn't sleep that night. The fear was still sharp in my chest, a constant pressure that wouldn't let up. I tried to convince myself that the journal had just been a relic of someone's delusions, a misguided attempt to explain away normal things. But the whispers, they weren't a figment of my imagination. I had heard them clear as day. I stayed out of the house the entire next day, wandering aimlessly around town, trying to find any sort of distraction that could ease my mind. I needed to talk to someone, anyone, about the strange things happening in that house. But who could I tell? How could I explain that I was hearing voices and feeling like something was watching me, without sounding like a complete lunatic? By evening, I found myself standing in front of the house again, staring up at it. The house looked the same as it had when I moved in, its windows dark and uninviting, the worn porch steps creaking in the breeze. But now, it felt like a living thing, an entity that had grown aware of my presence, waiting for me to return. I knew I had to go back inside. There was something I needed to find. The journal had been too cryptic, too vague. I had to know more about the house's past, about what had happened to the people who lived there before me. The whispers and shadows in the corners weren't enough to make sense of it. I needed answers. I took a deep breath and pushed open the front door. The air inside was heavy, thick with that same musty smell. The house hadn't changed, but I knew it wasn't the same. The floor creaked as I walked across the entryway, and I felt that cold chill again creeping up my spine. It was as if the house knew what I had learned. I made my way upstairs, past the room where I'd found the journal, and into the hallway. Every step felt like it echoed louder than the last, a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. I could hear the faintest of sounds, whispers like the house was speaking to me, urging me to listen. I reached the small room at the end of the hall, the one that I hadn't dared to enter since moving in. The door was ajar, and the shadows inside seemed to shift as though they were alive. This was the room where the previous tenants had run out, screaming about curses, about something they had seen. The house had made them leave, but I couldn't just run. I needed to understand. I needed to know why this house had such a hold on me. I stepped inside. The room was colder than the rest of the house, the air stale, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. There was an odd smell, faint but lingering, like incense or something burning. A small, low window let in just enough light to see the faint outline of a chair in the center of the room. It wasn't the same one I had seen earlier. This one looked older, its wood worn and chipped, as if it had been used far too often. And then I saw it. On the floor near the chair was a set of markings, symbols drawn hastily in chalk, smeared with age. Some were simple, circles within circles, but others were complex, twisted, and jagged. They weren't just decorations. They were deliberate, drawn in a pattern that felt intentional. I crouched down to examine them, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. As I touched one of the symbols, the temperature in the room dropped even further. I could see my breath now, and I shivered, the chill creeping into my bones. A sudden noise made me jump. It came from the corner of the room, a scraping sound like something was dragging across the floor. I whipped around, heart racing. But there was nothing there. No one. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows reaching toward me, and I realized with a sinking feeling that the symbols on the floor weren't just random markings. They were a trap. They were a boundary, a way of binding something or someone to the house. I stood up quickly, my pulse pounding in my ears. I couldn't stay in this room any longer. As I turned to leave, I glanced back one last time. The chair had moved. I hadn't heard it creak, hadn't seen it shift, but there it was, slightly turned, facing me. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't hesitate. I bolted from the room, slamming the door behind me. The hallway seemed even darker now, the shadows more oppressive. The whispers had grown louder, almost too loud to ignore. I had to get out, had to leave the house, but something pulled me back. I couldn't run. Not yet. I had one last thing to do. I headed down to the basement. I had to know about the original owner of the house. The one who had drawn those strange symbols, the one whose obsession with the occult had sealed this place's fate. I had to find something that would explain all of this, give me some answers. The basement door creaked as I pulled it open, the smell of mildew and dust hitting me immediately. The stairs descended into pitch blackness, but I knew I had to go down there. There was something waiting for me. I flicked on the basement light, the bulb flickering once before casting its dim glow over the old storage room. Boxes were piled haphazardly around the room, some half open, revealing old books and knickknacks from previous tenants. But there, in the farthest corner, behind a stack of old crates, was something that caught my eye. The chest. It was old, like the house itself, its wood worn and cracked. I couldn't explain why, but I knew it held something important. I crossed the room quickly, heart thundering in my chest, and knelt down to open it. Inside was a collection of books, each bound in dark leather. The first one I pulled out was marked with strange symbols on the cover. The pages inside were filled with notes, rituals, and more sketches, drawings of doors, markings, and faces that seemed to watch me from the page. But it wasn't the drawings that chilled me. It was the last entry, scrawled in the same frantic handwriting I'd seen in the journal. Asterisk, the door is open. It cannot be closed. You have invited it in, and it will never leave. You will be its next. The house is its anchor. The door is its key. Asterisk. I felt a cold breath on my neck. I wasn't alone. I spun around, but there was nothing. Just the shadows in the corners stretching toward me. The door upstairs opened. The sound was unmistakable, a slow, deliberate creak like something was moving inside. And then the footsteps began. Heavy, dragging steps coming down the stairs. I didn't wait to see what was coming. I grabbed the chest and ran. The footsteps followed me, slow but steady, growing louder with each passing moment. My heart pounded in my chest as I dashed through the basement, the chest clutched tightly to my chest. I could feel my breath coming in ragged gasps, my legs aching from the sprint. Every instinct screamed at me to run faster, to escape before whatever was following me could catch up. But when I reached the stairs, I froze. The basement door was wide open. I hadn't left it open. The light above flickered again, casting erratic shadows along the staircase. The air grew heavier, as if something was pressing down on me from all sides. I could feel the coldness creeping under my skin, the icy fingers of fear curling around my spine. The footsteps were closer now, closer than they had been before. I could hear them on the stairs, dragging across the old wooden steps, the sound echoing in the narrow hallway. I wasn't imagining it. Something was in the house. Something had followed me down here. I backed away from the stairs, my mind racing. I had to get out. I had to escape. But as I turned to run, something stopped me. The chest. It felt too heavy in my hands now. As if it was alive, as if it was pulling me back toward the stairs. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant to be opened, that whatever was inside held the key to everything. I didn't want to open it, but I couldn't leave without knowing what it contained. I knelt down again, feeling a strange pull toward the chest. My fingers shook as I pried it open. Inside was a small leather-bound book. Its cover was cold to the touch, darker than the rest, almost black. I hesitated, but something in me, something deeper, urged me to open it. I flipped through the pages, each one filled with strange symbols, the same ones that had appeared on the floor upstairs. Rituals, incantations, and something else. A name. A name that sent a shiver through my entire body. Azazel. It was a name I'd never heard before, but it carried with it a weight, a terrible history. As I read, the words began to blur. They shifted before my eyes, the letters stretching and warping as if they were alive. The more I read, the more the air around me grew thick with an oppressive force. I could feel it, like a presence looming just beyond my sight. A pressure, as if something was trying to break through. Azazel was the name of the original owner of the house. He had been obsessed with the occult, with summoning and binding forces that were never meant to be tampered with. He had opened the door. He had invited something in. I slammed the book shut, but the room had changed. The temperature had dropped even further, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, shifting like smoke. I couldn't breathe. My throat tightened and a deep, primal fear rose in my chest. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The footsteps were back. But this time they weren't alone. There were multiple sets of heavy, dragging steps, coming from every direction. The walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows stretching, the air thickening with a suffocating dread. The house itself was alive, responding to the name I had just read, as if it had been waiting for me to uncover it. The chest shook in my hands and I dropped it, the impact of it hitting the floor sending a sharp jolt through my body. The footsteps had stopped, but now there was something worse, something that made the air feel even colder. A voice. It was faint at first, a whisper too quiet to make out. But as it grew louder, I could hear it clearly. It wasn't in my head. It was real. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come. Asterisk. The voice came from behind me. I didn't turn. I couldn't turn. I could feel its breath on my neck, cold and heavy, the unmistakable presence of something that should not be there. Asterisk, you opened the door. Asterisk. I didn't understand. What door? What had I opened? I had only found the journal, the chest, the book with the name. But somehow I had triggered something. Asterisk, it will never leave. Asterisk. The room seemed to bend, the walls warping and twisting around me. I could feel the floor beneath me shifting like the house itself was moving, groaning as if in pain. The shadows in the room grew, stretching like tendrils toward me. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let whatever this was consume me. But I knew deep down that it was too late. I bolted up the stairs, running with all the strength I had left. The house seemed to push against me as if it didn't want me to leave. The door at the top of the stairs was right in front of me, but it felt miles away. The footsteps were there again, behind me, closer this time. But I didn't dare look back. I reached the door, threw it open, and slammed it behind me. The house was silent. The air was thick with the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, suffocating and heavy. I stood in the hallway, breathless and shaking. My legs felt like they were made of stone, my body refusing to move. And then I heard it. A whisper, too faint to understand, but unmistakable. Asterisk, I'm waiting. Asterisk. I didn't need to hear any more. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was outside, away from the house, away from whatever it was that had been waiting for me. I didn't look back. I didn't even dare to breathe for fear that it would hear me. But as I walked away, I felt it, something behind me, following me. The house wasn't done with me, and it wasn't going to let me go. Not yet. I couldn't escape it. The whispers, the footsteps, the cold presence that lingered in the corners of my mind, no matter where I went, it would be there, waiting. I had opened the door, and now it would follow me wherever I went. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was still with me, even after I left the house. It lingered in the corners of my mind, just out of reach but never fully gone. I thought I could outrun it, that leaving the house behind would sever whatever invisible thread connected us. But no matter how far I drove, no matter where I went, it was there like a shadow on my soul. I moved to a new apartment. I thought a fresh start would help, but it didn't. The first night in my new place, I woke up to the sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, pacing back and forth in the hallway outside my bedroom door. My heart leaped into my throat and I held my breath, straining to hear. It couldn't be. The house was far behind me, wasn't it? I lay there, frozen, listening to the footsteps grow louder, coming closer. They stopped right outside my door. I could feel the pressure in the air, thick with something I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the sound of someone walking. It was like something was trying to find its way in. Something was looking for me. I bolted out of bed, my legs shaky as I crept toward the door. I had to check. I had to see. But when I opened it, the hallway was empty. There was nothing there, just the faint smell of damp earth in the air, a smell I couldn't place but that made my skin crawl. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The footsteps had stopped, but I knew they hadn't gone far. I closed the door slowly, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. I wasn't in that house anymore. But why did it feel like the house had followed me? The next few days were a blur of anxiety. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustling sound made me jump. I kept expecting to hear those footsteps again, to feel that cold pressure pressing in around me. But it was more than just the sounds. There were moments when the temperature in the apartment would drop suddenly, the air turning icy and heavy. I would feel a cold breath on my neck, but when I turned around, there would be nothing there. I tried to ignore it. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was still on edge from everything that had happened. But deep down, I knew the truth. The house was still with me, lingering in the shadows, feeding off my fear. I decided to visit the town library. Maybe I could find something that would explain what was happening to me. I couldn't live in fear forever, could I? There had to be a reason behind all of this. I spent hours searching through old newspapers and records, looking for anything related to the house, anything that might explain the curse or the name Azazel. It wasn't until I found a dusty old file in the back corner of the archives that I uncovered something that made my blood run cold. The original owner of the house, Azazel, had not just been obsessed with the occult. He had been an infamous figure in the town. His rituals were said to have drawn the attention of dark forces, forces that were believed to have attached themselves to the house. According to the file, there were reports of strange disappearances, people who had entered the house and never returned. There were whispers of blood rituals, of doors being opened that should have remained closed, and of things that came through, things that could not be explained by science or reason. But the most chilling part of the file was a letter, handwritten by the town's former mayor. It described how a group of townspeople had tried to burn down the house, believing that destroying it would break the curse. They were unsuccessful. The house had remained standing, untouched by fire or time. I sat back in the library chair, the weight of what I had just read settling in my chest. The house was more than just a building. It was a place of power, of dark energy that had been feeding off the people who had come and gone over the years. It wasn't just Azazel who had brought something into that house. It was the house itself, a living, breathing thing that had grown stronger with each passing year. And now it had found me. I left the library in a daze, my mind reeling from everything I had just uncovered. I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread that was creeping back into my bones, tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid. But as I walked through the streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whatever had followed me from the house was still there, waiting for me to make a mistake. I returned to my apartment, my thoughts spinning. I needed to confront this. I needed to face whatever was haunting me, or I would never be free. But how? How could I fight something that was so ancient, so powerful? That night, the footsteps returned. This time they were louder, closer, as if they were right outside my door. I stood frozen, my heart thudding in my chest. I could hear the scraping sound of something dragging across the floor, followed by a low, guttural whisper. Asterisk, you can't run. Asterisk. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice I had heard in the house, the same voice that had whispered to me in the basement. I gripped the edge of the door, my fingers numb. I knew I had to do something, but my mind was blank, filled with only one thought. I couldn't let it in. I backed away from the door slowly, my breath shallow and quick. The house had followed me, and now it was coming for me again. There was no escaping it. There was no way to stop it. I could feel it closing in, the pressure building around me. The whispers grew louder, the footsteps more frantic, as if whatever was out there knew I was finally listening. I had to leave again. But this time I couldn't run fast enough. The door to my apartment creaked open by itself, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, closing the distance with each step I took. I turned to see nothing but shadows, but I could feel it, a presence, dark and suffocating, following me as I fled down the hall. I didn't stop running. I didn't look back, but I could hear it just behind me, waiting for me to fall, waiting for me to make a mistake. And I knew, with a sinking feeling in my stomach, that no matter how far I went, it would never stop following me. I had opened the door, and now it was mine to face forever. I couldn't escape it. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, the house was always there, its presence haunting every step, every breath I took. It wasn't just the footsteps or the whispers that followed me. It was something far worse, the feeling that I was being watched, scrutinized, dissected by unseen eyes. The sensation gnawed at me constantly, tightening around my chest like a vice. The new apartment I had moved into, far from the cursed house, felt just as empty and oppressive as the place I had tried to leave behind. I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on me. At night, the quiet was deafening, and the air was thick with the weight of a presence I could never escape. It was as if the very atmosphere had been altered by whatever was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to slip up, waiting for the moment when I would once again let my guard down. Sleep became a distant memory. The nights were filled with the same heavy footsteps, the same low whispers that would rise from the darkness, drowning out my thoughts. The house was no longer just a place. It was a curse, one that had embedded itself into the very fabric of my existence. One evening, after a particularly restless night, I ventured out to try and clear my head. I wandered the streets aimlessly, hoping the cold night air would bring some clarity. As I passed the local park, something caught my eye, a figure standing alone in the shadows. I froze, my heart rate spiking. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I couldn't help but feel a connection to it, as if it were waiting for me. I approached cautiously, my instincts screaming at me to turn and run. But something Maybe curiosity, maybe desperation, kept me moving forward. When I was close enough, I saw the figure more clearly. It was a woman dressed in dark clothing, her face obscured by the hood of her jacket. She stood perfectly still, as if lost in thought. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice tentative. The woman turned her head slowly, and I could feel the weight of her gaze on me even though I couldn't see her eyes. There was something haunting about her presence, something familiar and unsettling all at once. "I know what you're going through," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "The house, it's not just a building. It's a doorway. A portal to something else." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "How do you know?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced down at the ground, her fingers tugging nervously at the hem of her sleeve. When she spoke again, her voice was laced with a deep sadness. "I was there. I used to live in that house, just like you. But I left. I had to leave before it consumed me." Her words sent a chill through me. I took a step back, my mind reeling. How could she have known? Had she been there too? Had she experienced the same things I had? "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, feeling the anger rise in my chest. "Why didn't you warn me?" The woman's expression softened, and she took a slow step toward me. "I didn't know who you were, but I see it now. The same fear in your eyes. The same terror I had when I was trapped in that place." I felt a knot form in my stomach as she spoke. "What happened to you? What did you see in that house?" She hesitated, then looked around as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. "I saw things that shouldn't exist. And I heard voices. Voices of the people who had come before me. They all left, one by one, but they didn't leave the house. They stayed there, trapped, waiting for someone else to take their place." A shiver ran down my spine as I processed her words. The same people. The same voices. They were all still in that house. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman shook her head. "Who would believe me? The house has a way of making people doubt themselves. It twists your mind. It makes you think you're crazy. That's how it gets you. And once it has you, it doesn't let go." I could feel the weight of her words sinking in. She was right. I had doubted myself countless times. The house had made me question everything, my sanity, my perception of reality. But now I understood. It wasn't me. It was the house. It was the thing that lived inside it, the thing that had followed me here. The woman took a deep breath and stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If you want to survive, you need to break the cycle. You need to destroy the house. Destroy it before it destroys you." The thought of going back to that place, of confronting whatever dark force was hiding within those walls, filled me with a sense of dread. I had barely survived the last time I was there. But as the woman spoke, something in her words began to resonate with me. I couldn't just run forever. I couldn't keep living in fear. If there was even a chance to end this madness, I had to take it. "I don't know if I can," I admitted, the weight of the decision settling heavily on my shoulders. The woman nodded, her face shadowed by the hood. "You don't have to do it alone. But you have to act before it's too late. Time is running out." With those final words, she turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving me standing alone in the cold night air. I didn't know what to do with the information she had given me. I didn't know if I was strong enough to go back to that house. But I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Whatever had followed me from that house was still with me, waiting. And if I wanted to escape it, I had no choice but to face it head on. The woman's warning echoed in my mind as I walked back to my apartment, my steps slow and deliberate. The house was still out there, still calling to me, still waiting. And now I had no choice but to return. The decision had been made. There was no turning back now. I couldn't live in fear forever, waiting for something to happen, praying that the whispers would stop, or that the footsteps would fade. I had to face whatever was in that house head on. But the thought of returning to that place, the very place that had twisted my perception of reality, sent waves of dread through me. The woman's words haunted me, her warning echoing in the back of my mind. Destroy the house before it destroys you, but how could I destroy something like that? Something that had burrowed so deep into my soul, so far under my skin that it had become a part of me? How do you fight a house, a curse, a presence that seems to stretch far beyond the physical? As I walked back to the cursed house, my heart pounded in my chest. Each step felt like a betrayal, like I was walking straight into the jaws of something far darker than I had ever imagined. The house loomed before me, its silhouette outlined against the dimming sky. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for me. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it. My fingers clenched into fists at my sides, and I felt the sweat bead on my forehead. I wanted to turn and run. I wanted to flee as far as possible and never look back. But I couldn't. Not anymore. I stepped forward, the creaking of the wooden floorboards beneath my feet the only sound as I made my way to the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob, but I forced myself to turn it, to push open the door and step back into the darkness. The air inside the house was thick with dust and age. The smell of mildew clung to the walls, the scent of decay hanging in the air. But there was something else now, something more sinister. The house had changed. It felt alive in a way that I couldn't explain. I could feel its weight, its presence pressing down on me like a heavy hand on my chest. The floorboards creaked underfoot as I moved deeper into the house, the familiar sounds of the house settling around me. But it wasn't just the house settling. There was something else, something more intentional. It was as if the house was alive, breathing, watching me. I made my way through the hall, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The walls seemed to close in on me, narrowing the longer I stayed. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. The house had always been cold, but this was different. This was unnatural. The chills sank deep into my bones as if the very temperature had turned against me. I found myself drawn to the basement door, the one I had avoided before. The house had never allowed me to explore it fully, but now it seemed to call me. My hand reached for the knob before I could stop myself, and the door creaked open, revealing the staircase leading down into darkness. A wave of nausea hit me as I stood at the top of the stairs, the air growing thicker with each passing second. I knew what I had to do, but a part of me wanted to turn around, to flee. The weight of the house's power was too much to bear. But I couldn't back down now. I descended into the basement, my feet slipping slightly on the uneven steps. The air was musty, the smell of old wood and damp earth suffocating. The light from the single bulb hanging overhead flickered, casting long, unsettling shadows on the walls. The basement was far colder than the rest of the house, a biting chill that made my teeth chatter. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room, partially hidden in the shadows, was an old wooden chest. It looked out of place in the otherwise barren basement, its surface covered in layers of dust. But what struck me the most was the symbol carved into the lid, an intricate design, twisted and unfamiliar but oddly familiar at the same time. It was the same symbol I had seen in the journal, the one that belonged to the house's original owner, the one who had been obsessed with the occult. I hesitated for only a moment before moving toward the chest. My hand hovered over the lid, trembling as if the very act of opening it would unleash something terrible. But I couldn't stop now. I had to know. I had to understand what had happened in this place, what had driven the house's original owner to such madness. With a deep breath, I opened the chest. Inside, I found what I had expected, old, yellowed papers and books, their pages brittle with age. But there was something else, something that made my blood run cold. A journal. The same journal I had seen in the woman's memories, the one that had detailed the rituals and curses that had plagued this house. I picked up the journal, my fingers shaking as I flipped through its pages. The writing was erratic, frantic, as if the author had been losing their grip on reality with each passing day. But amidst the rambling words, there were details about the rituals, the entities that had been summoned, and the curse that had been placed upon the house. It was clear now. The house wasn't just a building. It was a prison for whatever had been awakened all those years ago. I read through the journal, my mind racing as the pieces began to fall into place. The house's original owner had been obsessed with the occult, had dabbled in things that no one should ever touch. The rituals had opened a door to something dark, something ancient. And now that door was still open. I closed the journal with shaking hands and stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the discovery sink in. I had known on some level that the house held a dark secret. But this was more than I could have ever imagined. Suddenly, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps from above. Slow, deliberate, heavy. My heart stopped and I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. I wasn't alone. The footsteps came closer, and I could hear the floorboards creaking under the weight of whatever was moving above me. I wasn't sure what I expected to see, but it certainly wasn't what I saw next. A shadow moved across the wall in front of me, tall and unmistakable. It was the figure of a man, but it wasn't human. The shape twisted unnaturally, the edges flickering like flames in the dark. I could feel its presence, the oppressive weight of it pressing down on me, suffocating me. And then the voice, whispering my name. I spun around, but there was nothing there, nothing but the cold, the darkness, and the sense of something closing in. It was too much. I had to leave. I had to get out. But as I turned toward the stairs, I felt the unmistakable sensation of something sitting on the edge of the bed behind me. I didn't look back. I sprinted up the stairs, my pulse hammering in my chest, the fear clawing at my insides. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All I could do was run. My feet pounded against the worn wood of the staircase, echoing in the silence of the house, but it felt like I was running through molasses. The walls pressed in on me, closing tighter with each step. The cold grew unbearable, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I reached the top of the stairs, and before I could process anything, I was at the door, my hands fumbling to turn the handle. The door swung open with an eerie creak, revealing the hallway beyond. The air was thick, like something was waiting, watching, but I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to escape. But as I stepped out of the room, I froze. The hallway wasn't the same. The walls, once faded and peeling, now appeared alive. They pulsed, breathing as if the house itself had a heartbeat. I could feel the oppressive weight of it all, the sense that something ancient and malevolent was slowly, inexorably wrapping its tendrils around my mind. My throat tightened. I tried to scream, but the sound stuck in my chest. The footsteps were louder now. They followed me every step I took. Slow, deliberate. They echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls like a cruel mockery of my own movements. But there was something else, something faint at first, a whisper, a murmur in the air. It was unintelligible, but it wasn't just sound. It felt like the very air was vibrating with something dark, something ancient. I didn't want to look, but I had to. My eyes darted to the end of the hallway, where the shadows seemed to stretch and shift, bending in ways they shouldn't. There, standing at the far end of the hall, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, its face obscured by shadows. But even from this distance, I could feel its eyes on me, watching me like it was waiting for something. I wanted to run. I wanted to get out of this house, away from this thing, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, like the weight of the house was pulling me down, keeping me rooted in place. Then the whisper grew louder, clearer. It was a voice I recognized. Asterisk, you should have listened. Asterisk. The words sent a chill down my spine, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I had heard them at all, or if they were just in my head. But then the figure moved, gliding toward me with an unnatural smoothness, its steps silent, like it wasn't even touching the ground. I stumbled backward, my breath ragged as I tried to pull myself away, but my feet wouldn't cooperate. The thing was getting closer, its presence filling the hallway, crowding me in. And then, a new sound joined the whispers, the sound of something scraping against the floor. It was the unmistakable sound of nails dragging, something sharp and jagged scraping against the wood. I spun around, my heart pounding in my throat, and saw what was behind me. The door to the basement, the one I had just left, was wide open. A dark, empty void stretched out beyond the threshold, and from the shadows within came a low growl, a noise that wasn't quite human. The air grew thick with the smell of decay, like something rotting in the dark. I didn't think. I just ran. I sprinted down the hallway, my hands slamming against the walls as I tried to steady myself. The house seemed to shift around me, the floor tilting, the walls bending, warping like the very structure was alive, trying to devour me. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They were right behind me now, closing in with every step. I reached the front door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. The cold metal sent a jolt through my fingertips, and I yanked it open, stepping out into the night air. The crispness of the outside world hit me like a wave, a relief that felt almost foreign. I could breathe again. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were still there, following me, echoing through the darkness. I turned around, half expecting to see the thing standing behind me, but the house was empty. Silent. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, and I jumped back, heart racing. My mind couldn't process it. I had escaped, hadn't I? I was out of the house, away from the thing that had haunted me for so long. But the sound of the footsteps lingered, fading but not gone. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. All I knew was that I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I ran. I didn't care where. I just needed to get away from that house. Away from whatever was inside it. But no matter how far I ran, no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still there, waiting, watching, following. And as I glanced over my shoulder, I swear I saw a figure standing at the window, its silhouette staring out at me. It wasn't human, not anymore. It was something else. Something darker. I didn't stop running. I couldn't. But even as I left the house behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that the thing from inside was still with me, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next person to move in. The footsteps, though distant, followed me into the night. And I knew deep down that the house's curse had not been broken. It had only just begun. I don't know how long I ran. The world around me had become a blur of movement, my feet pounding the pavement, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Every street, every corner felt unfamiliar. The night was too still, too quiet, and yet I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being followed. It was as if the darkness itself had come alive, creeping behind me, keeping pace with my every step. I didn't stop until I reached a small, nondescript motel on the outskirts of town. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting a pale, sickly light across the cracked pavement. I didn't care about the place or its shabby appearance. I just needed somewhere to hide, somewhere that felt safer than the empty streets I'd been running through. I stumbled inside, barely able to focus enough to tell the clerk my name. As soon as I got to the room, I locked the door behind me. I didn't even take the time to unpack my things. I just collapsed onto the bed, staring up at the peeling ceiling, my body trembling uncontrollably. The sound of my own breathing was the only thing I could hear, but it was too loud. It rattled in my chest, filling the room, making it feel like the walls were closing in. I wanted to sleep, but I was too scared to close my eyes. Every time I did, I saw the house. Its decaying walls, its dark windows, the figure standing in the doorway watching me. I saw the thing that had followed me, its gaunt face twisted into a grotesque grin. I could still hear the whispers, the words that hadn't left my mind since I'd heard them. Asterisk, you should have listened. Asterisk, but who had spoken them? The figure in the hallway? Or something else? Something deeper, something older that lived in the house, waiting for its next victim. I tried to tell myself it was over. I'd left the house behind. It was just an old place, filled with creepy noises and strange occurrences. Nothing more. But the unease in my gut wouldn't go away. Every creak in the motel, every rustle in the corner of the room made my skin crawl. And then I heard it. At first, it was just a soft noise, barely audible over the hum of the motel's outdated air conditioner. A faint scraping like nails against wood. I tried to ignore it. It had to be nothing. The house, the footsteps, they were behind me now. But the sound persisted, growing louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was dragging its nails against the door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, as if it were savoring the moment. The sound was maddening, like it was coming from all around me, filling the room with a suffocating pressure. I had to look. I had to know what it was. I crept out of bed, my legs shaking beneath me. My fingers hovered over the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I didn't want to see whatever was on the other side. The scratching stopped abruptly. I stood there listening. The silence that followed was deafening. I should have opened the door. I should have checked, but I couldn't. The fear, the paralyzing dread, held me in place. And then the air in the room grew colder, the temperature dropping sharply as though something had sucked the warmth out of the space. A soft voice, barely a whisper, drifted through the door. Asterisk, you can't escape. Asterisk. It was the same voice I had heard in the house. The one that had warned me. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here. But no matter how much I wanted to run, my body wouldn't move. The fear had completely paralyzed me, locking me in place, holding me captive in this room. And then the door handle rattled. I flinched, my breath catching in my throat. The door rattled again, louder this time, as if something was trying to get in. The hinges creaked, the wood groaned under the pressure, and then, as if by some cruel twist of fate, the door swung open. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just stared at the figure standing in the doorway. It was tall, too tall. Its body was twisted, its limbs unnaturally long, stretched out in grotesque angles. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the darkness. It didn't say a word. It didn't need to. The malevolent presence it exuded filled the room, suffocating me, choking the air from my lungs. And then it stepped inside. The room seemed to collapse around me as it moved closer, its feet making no sound on the carpet. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare, paralyzed by fear, as the thing moved toward me. It reached out, its hand, its skeletal hand, lifting toward my face. I could feel the cold radiating from it, like a deathly chill that froze the very air around it. Its fingers brushed against my cheek, sending an electric shock of terror through my body. And then it spoke. Asterisk, you should have listened. Asterisk. The words were cold, hollow, and they reverberated through my skull like a death knell. And as it spoke, the room seemed to fade, the edges of my vision blurring, spinning into darkness. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. And then everything went black. I don't know how much time passed. It felt like hours, maybe days, but when I opened my eyes again, I was back in the room. The motel room. The smell of stale air mixed with the faint scent of mildew was the first thing I registered, but it felt wrong, distorted. As if the room I had just left, where I had felt safe, trapped, and helpless, had never really existed. I sat up, my body stiff, my heart thumping in my chest. My hands were trembling as I wiped the cold sweat from my forehead. I was awake, wasn't I? I had to be. The room felt normal, but something was off. The air was too heavy, too thick. And then I heard it. The sound. That scraping again. Faint, but there. I froze, my pulse quickening. It was coming from the bathroom, behind the thin door at the far side of the room. I didn't want to look, didn't want to acknowledge it, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned my head toward the bathroom, my body tense, ready to bolt at the first sign of movement. But the door was closed, just like it had been before. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. The sound was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was all just in my head. My mind had been playing tricks on me ever since I left that damn house. I couldn't trust it anymore. But then the door creaked open. I didn't have time to move, to react. Before I could even stand, something stepped into the room. A shadow at first, but it grew taller, more distinct. The figure I had seen before. The one from the house. The one that had haunted my every step, my every thought. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, tight with fear. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The thing moved closer, its presence filling the room like a dark cloud. It didn't need to walk. It glided, its feet hovering just above the floor. It stopped in front of me, its form flickering in and out like static on a broken television. I couldn't see its face, not fully, but I felt its eyes on me. Cold, unforgiving. "You should have listened," it whispered again, its voice like ice scraping across bone. I was paralyzed, unable to speak, unable to react. I could feel its breath, if it even had breath, on my skin, a chill that went deeper than the bone. It was everywhere, in the air, in my mind. The whispering was louder now, almost deafening. I wanted to cover my ears, but my hands wouldn't obey. "It was never just the house," it said. Asterisk, "you opened the door. You let it in. Now there's nowhere to run." Asterisk. The air grew even colder. I could feel the weight of the thing's presence pressing in on me, suffocating me. My heart pounded, and yet I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in its gaze. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stepped back. But it didn't leave. It just stood there, at the edge of my vision, watching me, waiting. I could feel its eyes burning into my soul, probing, searching for something. I couldn't look away. I didn't dare. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice a low, guttural growl now. Asterisk, "Not anymore. It's already too late." Asterisk. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls narrowing, the ceiling lowering. I could feel the space constricting, like the house itself was squeezing me, trying to force me back into its dark, suffocating embrace. I could hear the whispers, growing louder, more frantic. The words weren't just in my head anymore. They were everywhere. Asterisk, "You should have listened. You should have," asterisk. Suddenly there was a deafening crash. The floor beneath me seemed to give way, and I fell forward, my face slamming into the cold, hard ground. My vision blurred and everything spun. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The fear was all-consuming, like a black void swallowing me whole. And then, just as abruptly, everything stopped. The noise, the pressure, the fear. It was gone. I blinked, my eyes snapping open. The room was back to normal. The motel room. The bathroom door was shut. The figure was gone. There was no sound. No whispers. Just silence. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for air, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I stumbled to the door, yanking it open, desperate for the outside world. I didn't care where I was, as long as it was far away from that room, from that thing. I ran down the hall of the motel, but as I reached the exit, I froze. The front door was wide open. I didn't open it. Slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, I turned around. The hallway was dark, but at the far end, a figure stood, facing away from me. It was tall, too tall, its limbs twisted, its face hidden in shadow. It wasn't just the house anymore. It wasn't just the figure in the hallway. It was following me. "You should have listened," it whispered, its voice unmistakable, clear as day. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the figure. And for the first time I understood. There was no escape. There was no running. Whatever I had unleashed, whatever I had invited in, was never going to leave me. And as the figure stepped forward, the motel door swinging open with a creak, I realized that I had become a part of the curse. There was no ending, no resolution. Just endless darkness. The same whispers, the same cold air, the same chilling presence that would follow me wherever I went for as long as I lived. Asterisk, you should have listened. Asterisk. The last thing I saw was the door closing, darkness swallowing me whole. And then nothing. Story 2. When I pulled up to the old house on Hollowcrest Lane, I told myself it was exactly what I wanted, a fresh start. After the divorce, life had become a series of cramped apartments and lukewarm dinners eaten in silence. The idea of moving to this quiet little town, away from the noise and the pitying stares of my co-workers, felt like a lifeline. The house itself was a relic, standing tall and defiant against the backdrop of skeletal trees and the faint outline of the mountains. It was cheap too, suspiciously cheap. The realtor had danced around the topic when I asked why it had been on the market for so long. Just a bit of bad luck, she'd said, flashing that overly bright smile, her polished nails clicking against the contract. I didn't press her. My savings were stretched thin as it was, and this was the only house I could afford. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the smell, a mix of wood varnish and something faintly metallic like old pennies. The floorboards groaned under my feet as I walked through the empty rooms. The house had character, as they say. I decided I liked it. I spent the rest of the day unloading boxes, sweating through my shirt as the sun blazed through the high, narrow windows. The movers had left hours earlier, and the house was still eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of wood. By evening, I had the essentials unpacked: my bed, a few dishes, and my desk. The first night was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to nerves and exhaustion. The house settled noisily as I lay in bed, staring at the shadows cast by the street lamp outside. Every creak and groan seemed amplified in the silence. Eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, I met my neighbor, Mrs. Harlow. She was a wiry woman in her 70s, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She greeted me with a loaf of banana bread and a warning. "You're braver than most," she said, handing me the bread wrapped neatly in foil. "Why's that?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. She hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the house. "People don't stay long in that place. Always moving out in a hurry, leaving things behind." I laughed nervously. "It's just an old house. A little creaky, but nothing I can't handle." Mrs. Harlow pressed her lips together, as if debating whether to say more. Finally, she leaned in and lowered her voice. "The last tenant ran out of there in the middle of the night. Said she heard things, footsteps, voices. People talk about curses, but I don't put much stock in that." I forced a smile, though her words left a knot in my stomach. "I'll be fine. Thanks for the bread." That night, as I sat in the living room unpacking more boxes, I thought about what she'd said. Footsteps? Voices? It was absurd. The house was old, and old houses made noise. Still, as the clock ticked past midnight and the house grew quieter, I found myself straining to listen for any sound that didn't belong. At first, I heard nothing unusual. But just as I was about to head to bed, I heard it, a soft creak like a footstep on the stairs. My heart leapt into my throat. I sat frozen, listening. The sound didn't come again, and I convinced myself it was just the house settling. But as I climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Harlow had been right. People didn't stay long in this house, and I was beginning to wonder why. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, washing the room in pale gold. It was the kind of light that made you question the fear of the night before, as if the shadows had only been playing tricks on you. I shook off the unease from last night, telling myself it had been my imagination. Sleep deprivation, maybe. I decided to spend the day getting to know the house better. I started in the living room, a spacious area with high ceilings and ornate crown molding. It was clear that this house had been grand once, though time had worn it down. The wallpaper was peeling in places, revealing faded patches underneath. I made a mental note to fix it eventually. The kitchen was smaller than I liked, with outdated appliances and a lingering smell I couldn't quite identify. I scrubbed the counters, hoping to rid the space of whatever had left that faintly sour odor. The pantry door creaked as I opened it, revealing shelves lined with dust and cobwebs. In the back corner, something caught my eye, a small, rusted latch embedded in the floorboards. I crouched down, brushing away the dirt, and realized it was some kind of trapdoor. Curiosity tugged at me, but the latch wouldn't budge. It was stuck, either rusted shut or locked from below. I told myself I'd deal with it later and moved on. By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted from cleaning and organizing. The house looked marginally better, though its quirks were becoming more apparent. The floorboards in the hallway seemed to groan under my weight no matter how carefully I stepped. There was a faint draft near the windows, though I couldn't find any cracks. And then there were the sounds, soft creaks, occasional taps. almost rhythmic at times. I told myself it was nothing. Houses like this had personalities, didn't they? After dinner, I settled into the living room with a book, hoping to unwind. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves outside. I was just starting to relax when I heard it again, a creak on the stairs. I froze, my eyes darting toward the staircase at the far end of the room. The light from my lamp didn't reach that far, leaving the stairs cloaked in shadow. I waited, breath held, but no other sound followed. Old house, I muttered under my breath, trying to steady myself. Still, I couldn't ignore the prickling at the back of my neck, the feeling that I wasn't alone. Deciding I needed a distraction, I grabbed my phone and scrolled mindlessly through social media. That's when I got a notification, a message from a number I didn't recognize. "How's the house?" I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. At first, I thought it might be the realtor, but wouldn't she have identified herself? I typed a cautious reply, "Who is this?" The response came almost instantly, "Just a concerned neighbor." "You've noticed it, haven't you?" My fingers hovered over the screen. My first instinct was to block the number, but curiosity got the better of me. "Noticed what?" A long pause. Then, "It's better if you don't ask." I stared at the message, unease spreading through me like cold water. I put the phone down, trying to shake off the creeping paranoia. Maybe it was a prank. People in small towns could be nosy, right? The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, though I couldn't relax. Every sound seemed louder, more deliberate. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would come quickly. But sleep didn't come. At first, I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the occasional creak of the house. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound like bare feet on hardwood. My eyes snapped open. The sound was faint but distinct, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. The shuffling grew louder, closer, until it stopped just outside my door. I held my breath, staring at the crack of light under the door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the doorknob rattled, a quiet metallic jingle that sent a jolt of fear through me. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The rattling stopped. Silence pressed against my ears. I didn't dare move. I lay there, clutching the blanket, my heart hammering in my chest. Minutes passed, then hours, and eventually exhaustion took over. When I woke the next morning, the house was eerily still. I stepped into the hallway, half expecting to see footprints or some sign of an intruder, but there was nothing. The doorknob looked undisturbed. Maybe I dreamed it, but deep down I knew better. Something was wrong with this house, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know what. The days began to blur together after that. I kept telling myself it was just my nerves, my mind playing tricks on me in an unfamiliar place. The house creaked, the wind howled at night, and the floorboards seemed to moan under my weight. These were all normal things, right? Old houses did that. It didn't mean anything. But the more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. The footsteps continued, always when the house was at its quietest, always just outside my door or in the hall. The rattling doorknob, too, hadn't stopped, though it was less frequent now. I would wake in the night to hear it, and the feeling of something, on the other side would grip my chest in a vice. Mrs. Harlow had been right about one thing. People didn't stay long in this house. A few nights ago, I found an old newspaper clipping stuffed between the pages of a book I'd bought at a yard sale. It was yellowed and crinkled, the print faded, but I could make out the words. "Tragedy strikes at Hollowcrest House. Young woman found dead, foul play suspected." I'd kept the clipping for later, thinking I might research it more, but I hadn't gotten around to it. The curiosity gnawed at me, though, so I decided to pay a visit to the town library the following morning. The librarian, a middle-aged woman with glasses perched at the end of her nose, seemed oddly cautious when I asked about the house. She told me there were a few records on it in the archives but didn't offer much else. I thanked her and headed down to the basement, where the old records were kept. As I sifted through dusty files and brittle papers, I came across the name of the house's original owner, Elias Marlowe. According to the files, he was a man of wealth and influence in the early 1900s. A philanthropist, they said, though nothing about his reputation seemed to line up with what I'd been hearing. The more I read, the more unsettling the details became. Marlowe was known to have been obsessed with the occult. There were rumors of strange rituals held in the house, dark ceremonies meant to summon forces beyond human comprehension. I read accounts of neighbors hearing eerie chanting late at night, of strange lights seen flickering from the windows when no one was supposed to be home. One entry stood out in particular. Marlowe's sudden disappearance. Authorities found a hidden room in the basement filled with symbols, journals, and what appeared to be a portal of some sort. No trace of him was ever found, though the house remained eerily quiet after. The word sent a cold shiver through me. I was ready to leave, my hands trembling, when I spotted a leather-bound journal tucked between two heavy volumes. It was old, the edges worn and curling. I opened it cautiously, my heart skipping a beat when I saw the name written on the first page, Elias Marlowe. As I skimmed through the pages, my stomach turned. The journal was filled with ramblings about rituals, symbols, and what he referred to as the opening. Marlowe believed he could cross into another world, a place filled with power and knowledge. He mentioned making contact with entities, beings that could give him what he desired but at a cost. The door is open now, one entry read, but it will not be kind. The price has been paid, and I will not be the last to suffer. I slammed the journal shut, heart pounding in my chest. I had to leave, I realized. The house, the man, the things he had done, it was all too much. But even as I made my way back to the house, my mind raced with questions. What had he summoned? What had he unleashed? When I arrived back at the house, the sun had begun to set. The air had a strange chill to it, and I shivered as I unlocked the door. The house felt different now, heavier. I could almost feel the weight of the darkness pressing in around me. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I dropped my things by the door and went straight upstairs. The house felt unnaturally still, the usual creaks and groans absent for the moment. But as I passed the old attic door, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I whipped around, but no one was there. My heart slammed against my ribs, my breath shallow. I knew I was no longer alone. The house had become more than just a building. It had become something alive, something that wanted me to feel its presence. And I wasn't sure how long I could keep pretending it was all in my head. The footsteps continued, and this time I didn't turn around. I couldn't. That night, the house seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain. The air felt thick, as if it were pressing in from all sides, suffocating. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that the unsettling feelings I'd been having were just the product of my overactive imagination. The events from the previous nights, the footsteps, the rattling doorknob, were all things that could be explained away. Houses settled, creaked, and groaned with age. I could rationalize it all if I tried hard enough. But there was no denying the cold chill that had seeped into my bones, or the way the house felt, hungry. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, trying to block out the noise. That strange sound, a soft scratching noise, had started again, this time coming from somewhere beneath the floorboards. It was slow and methodical, like something, or someone, was trying to claw its way out. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the sound only grew louder, like it was right beneath me. Panic bubbled up from my stomach, threatening to choke me. I wanted to call someone, to scream, but I couldn't move. I felt paralyzed. Suddenly the sound stopped, and then I heard it. A voice. It wasn't clear, but I could make out words, garbled and faint. It sounded like someone whispering in a language I didn't recognize. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively pulled the blanket over my head, hoping it would shield me from whatever was happening in the room. The whispering grew louder, almost as if it were circling around me. The walls felt like they were closing in. I shot out of bed, the floor cold beneath my bare feet. I fumbled for the light switch, but the moment I flicked it on, the whispering ceased. Everything went dead silent. I stood there, heart hammering in my chest, staring at the empty room. But I wasn't alone. The shadows in the corner of the room twisted unnaturally, stretching and writhing like they had a life of their own. My mind screamed at me to look away, but I couldn't. The darkness seemed to pull at me, drawing me in, filling my senses with a cold dread. And then, just as quickly as it started, the shadows dissipated, leaving nothing but an eerie stillness in their wake. I felt dizzy. My hands were trembling as I reached for the door, desperate to get out of the room. But when I turned the knob, it wouldn't budge. I twisted it harder, panic rising in my throat as the door remained firmly shut. I banged on the door with both fists, shouting, "Let me out, please." But my voice sounded muffled, swallowed by the oppressive silence that had descended over the house. I was trapped. The air around me grew colder still, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. I backed away from the door, my heart racing. My gaze swept over the room. Nothing looked out of place. But I could feel it now. Something was here in the room with me. It had been there all along. I was being watched. The temperature continued to drop, and I could hear the faintest sound, like soft, shuffling footsteps approaching from behind me. My pulse quickened as I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing. And yet, the footsteps didn't stop. They were getting closer. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran. I bolted out of the room and down the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. My legs were weak with fear, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had to get out of this house. I didn't care where I went, just anywhere but here. I rushed down the stairs, my feet slipping on the worn treads, but I didn't slow down. I reached the front door, yanked it open, and froze. Standing on the porch was Mrs. Harlow. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with something that looked like recognition. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. What?" I stammered, still panting. "The house," she said, taking a step back, her hand trembling as she reached out to me. "It's too late. It's already chosen you." I could feel my heart sinking. "Chosen me? What are you talking about?" "The curse," she said, her voice almost a whisper now. "It's in the house, in the walls. It's not something you can run from. You have to leave before it's too late." Before I could respond, a loud bang echoed from inside the house, followed by a deep, guttural growl that sent my blood running cold. Mrs. Harlow's face contorted in fear. "It's already too late," she said, her voice breaking. The growl grew louder, and suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut, as if the house itself had closed me in. The last thing I saw was Mrs. Harlow's terrified expression before the world around me dissolved into darkness. I woke up on the floor, the cold wood pressing against my cheek. The air was thick with dust and mildew, the house strangely quiet, too quiet. For a moment, I thought maybe I had dreamed everything. The footsteps, the whispering, Mrs. Harlow's warnings. But then I heard it again, unmistakable and low, a growl. It came from somewhere deep in the house, somewhere far below. My breath caught in my throat and I pushed myself to my feet, trying to steady myself. I glanced around the living room, the dim light filtering in through the dusty curtains. Everything seemed unchanged, but the oppressive sense of being watched still clung to the air, thick and suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, just out of sight, just beyond the edges of my awareness. The door I had tried to open earlier was now wide, as though it had never been closed. I didn't understand it. I had just heard the loud bang, the unmistakable sound of it slamming shut, but now it was as if nothing had ever happened. Panic bubbled up inside me as I stepped closer, hesitant to touch the door, but too afraid to ignore it. What had Mrs. Harlow meant? Chosen? What was going on in this place? The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, the ticking of an old clock in the corner marking time in a way that felt wrong. Time didn't seem to move in the house. I took a breath and stepped outside, the chill of the evening air hitting me as I walked down the porch steps. But before I could even think about leaving, the growl sounded again, this time louder and closer. It wasn't an animal. No, it wasn't anything I could explain. It sounded human. The growl was followed by a low, rasping breath, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I turned back toward the house, but the door slammed shut behind me with an unnatural force. I jumped, my heart racing as I scrambled to get back inside, my hands shaking. The growl was gone, replaced by the sound of something heavy moving in the house, dragging along the floorboards. Something was walking. I didn't know if it was even human, but I wasn't about to find out. I didn't want to wait for whatever it was to come closer. I couldn't. Without thinking, I sprinted down the dirt road, the darkness swallowing me whole as I left the house behind. The sound of footsteps, the low growl, followed me, distant but unmistakable. The wind whipped through my hair, and I barely dared to glance over my shoulder. But something pulled at me, something inside that felt as if I was leaving more than just a house behind. There was a presence in the air, thick and oppressive, and the house, it felt like it was pulling at my very soul, reaching out, trying to keep me there. I could almost hear the whispers again, soft and insistent. But I kept running. I couldn't stop, couldn't give in. My chest heaved with each breath, my legs burning, but I pushed on, willing myself to get away. I could hear my footsteps in the dirt, the rhythm of them so steady that it almost felt like they weren't mine at all. They matched the growl I had heard earlier, like they were a part of me now. It wasn't just the house that had marked me, it was whatever had been living inside it. I stumbled down the road for what felt like miles, the house now a distant silhouette behind me. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I realized the growl was gone. The silence was overwhelming. But it wasn't the peaceful kind of silence. It was the kind that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, the kind that made you feel like you weren't alone. The wind picked up again, the air colder than it had been before. And then I heard it, the faintest sound, as if something was scratching at my mind, trying to break through. I turned toward the direction of the house, but there was nothing there. The night stretched out before me, a thick darkness that swallowed everything in its path. My mind raced with the images of the house, Mrs. Harlow's cryptic words, the journal of Elias Marlowe. The house, it had been waiting for me. But why? I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I didn't know how long I stood there in the road, my body frozen, my thoughts spinning. I wasn't sure where to go from here. I had to leave to escape this place before whatever was in the house found me. But where could I go? The town was small and no one would believe me. No one would understand. They would all think I was crazy. Hell, I almost thought I was crazy. The house had been quiet when I left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I needed answers. I had to find out what had happened to Elias Marlowe, what had caused the darkness to take root in that house. But I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever I might find. It was then that I heard the sound again, slow, deliberate footsteps, not behind me but ahead. I spun around, my heart in my throat. A figure stood at the edge of the road, shrouded in shadow. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it was watching me. Then in the distance, the house loomed, its windows black and empty. The figure stepped closer, its face still hidden in darkness, and my blood ran cold. I was no longer free. I was still tethered to that house. And whatever was waiting inside, whatever had been awakened, was coming for me. I stood frozen in the middle of the road, staring at the figure ahead of me. My heart thudded in my chest and I tried to swallow, but my throat had gone dry. The shadow was moving closer, slow and deliberate, its steps echoing in the stillness of the night. I couldn't see its face, but there was something about the way it moved that sent a chill deep into my bones. It wasn't human, not in the way I understood. Felt wrong. The air had grown colder, the wind biting into my skin, and for a moment, I thought I saw the outline of the house behind the figure. But it was different now, distorted, as though it were warping in and out of reality. I blinked, and it was just a house again, standing silent and unmoving in the distance. But I could feel it, the pull, the way it tugged at me, beckoning me back. "Who are you?" I finally managed to croak, my voice barely above a whisper. My legs felt like they were made of stone, unable to move. I was trapped. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stopped about 10 feet away from me, still cloaked in shadow. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I had to face it, whatever it was. I had to know. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stepped back into the darkness, vanishing as if it had never been there at all. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air around me seemed to tighten, the weight of something heavy pressing down on me. My heart pounded in my chest and my thoughts raced. That wasn't just some random stranger. No, it had to be connected to the house. It had to be something, someone, from there drawn out by my presence. Or maybe it was waiting for me to return. Waiting for me to make a choice. I could still hear the faintest sound of footsteps, distant but unmistakable, echoing in the back of my mind. I spun around, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the quiet rustling of the wind and the endless stretch of the road. I wasn't alone. I couldn't go back to the house. Not after everything that had happened. But where could I go? I was trapped, caught in the web of whatever dark force had taken root in that place. Mrs. Harlowe's warning echoed in my mind. "It's already chosen you." I shuddered, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I wanted to run, to flee to safety, but I had nowhere to go. The figure had been close, so close I could feel the coldness it carried with it, like the touch of death itself. I could still feel its presence, hovering at the edges of my awareness. I didn't know how much time had passed before I turned and started walking again. My legs were shaky, my head spinning, but I had no choice. I had to get away from that road, away from the house, but the pull of it, the feeling that something was waiting for me, kept me moving forward. I didn't know how long I walked, but eventually the familiar outline of the town came into view. I stumbled down the dimly lit streets, my mind racing with thoughts of Elias Marlowe, the house, the figure, and the things I had heard. The growling, the whispers. It felt like I had crossed some threshold and there was no going back. As I passed the streetlight, I saw someone standing in the shadows. My heart leapt into my throat and I instinctively froze, my body tense. But it wasn't the shadowy figure from before. It was Mrs. Harlowe. She looked even more pale than I remembered, her eyes wide with fear. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice shaking. I have to get out of here," I stammered, my voice cracking. "There's something in that house. I'm not safe." Mrs. Harlowe nodded gravely, her hands trembling. "I tried to warn you. You don't understand. It's not just the house, it's what's inside it. It's been waiting for someone like you." I shook my head, confused. "What do you mean? What's inside? What happened to Elias Marlowe?" She glanced over her shoulder, her face full of dread. "You have to leave. You can't stay here anymore. It's already..." She stopped herself as if she had said too much. I stepped closer. What's going on? Why didn't you tell me the whole story? She hesitated before speaking, her voice barely a whisper. Because I didn't want to make you a part of it. I didn't want to drag you in. I didn't understand. What was she talking about? But before I could ask any more questions, a loud bang echoed in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door slamming shut. My heart raced as I looked toward the sound, my body frozen in place. I could feel it, the oppressive weight of something watching us, something moving closer. Mrs. Harlow turned toward the sound, her face pale with terror. It's already started. I spun around, desperate to find a way out, but it was too late. The streets that had once felt safe now seemed to close in on me. The shadow of the house loomed large in the distance, its windows dark and lifeless. And I realized with a sickening clarity that no matter how far I ran, I was never going to escape. The house had already claimed me. I heard the growl again, low and guttural, vibrating through the ground. It was coming closer. I turned back to Mrs. Harlow, but she was gone. Gone without a trace. I was alone again. But I wasn't really alone. The footsteps were getting louder now, as if something was right behind me. And I knew without a doubt that whatever was waiting in the dark wasn't going to stop until it had me. I ran. My legs burned with every step, my heart pounding against my ribcage like it was trying to break free. The air was thick with a biting chill that seemed to follow me, pressing down on my chest. I couldn't breathe. The footsteps behind me were relentless, matching my pace, keeping time with my frantic breaths. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I was already being hunted, and if I stopped, if I looked, it might be the end. The road stretched on, empty and endless, but I couldn't escape. The sound of those footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed in the night, growing louder with every step I took. Whoever, or whatever, was following me wasn't in a hurry. It didn't need to be. It knew I couldn't outrun it. I pushed myself harder, my shoes pounding the dirt road, but the weight of exhaustion was already heavy in my legs, my body starting to give way. I could feel it, the pull of the house, as if it had a magnetic force drawing me back, tethering me to it, keeping me close. The growl sounded again, this time coming from somewhere behind me, low and guttural. It was closer now. I could hear it in my bones. Suddenly, the road forked, splitting into two directions. I didn't know which way to go, didn't know which path would lead to safety, if such a thing even existed anymore. I stood there, panting, my mind a blur. The footsteps had stopped, but the presence, something dark and unnatural, still lingered in the air. It was as if the house itself had infected everything around me, even the town. I had nowhere to run. I chose the path to the left, stumbling down it, hoping, praying, that I could find something, anything to give me a way out. The further I went, the darker it became, the trees towering over me like silent sentinels, blocking out the moonlight. There was no escape here either. The air felt thick with something ancient and hungry. A cold wind swept through the trees and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The wind carried with it a faint whisper. My name. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it was there. A voice as cold and hollow as the wind itself. I spun around, but there was no one in sight. Yet the air felt charged, as though something was watching me from the shadows. The whisper came again. Come back. I couldn't tell if it was the wind, the house, or something else entirely, but the voice was unmistakable. It was calling me back. Back to the house. I had to keep moving. I couldn't go back. But my legs wouldn't listen. My body, trembling with fear, came to a stop. The world seemed to hold its breath, the silence deafening. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything, of the house, of the figure, of Mrs. Harlow's warning. Nothing made sense. I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up, unable to escape. The footsteps were back, closer now. I turned, hoping to find some refuge in the dark woods, but there was no hiding from whatever was following me. The shadows seemed to bend and twist, alive with movement. And then I saw it. A figure stepped out from the trees, cloaked in darkness. Its face was a shadow, its form shifting in ways that made it impossible to understand. I could feel its eyes on me even though I couldn't see them. It was just there, watching, waiting. The air grew colder still, the wind picking up again, pushing against me like a physical force. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, of being judged. I didn't know what this thing wanted, but I was certain it didn't mean me any good. What are you? I whispered, my voice barely a sound against the wind. It didn't answer. Instead, it took a step toward me and I stumbled back, the earth beneath my feet suddenly too uneven to keep my balance. I fell, my hands scraping against the cold ground as I tried to push myself up. But the figure didn't stop. It moved closer and I could feel it now, the coldness, the weight of its presence pressing down on me like a vice. I scrambled to my feet and bolted, my pulse racing. Every step felt like it took all my strength, but I had no choice. I couldn't stay. I ran, and the footsteps followed, a constant rhythmic thudding against the ground. The figure wasn't far behind. It was getting closer. I didn't know how long I had been running or how much farther I had to go, but eventually the road ahead split again. This time it wasn't a choice. It was instinct. I turned right, hoping this was the way out. The trees thinned slightly, the road opening up to a wider path, but the figure was still there, just beyond my reach. The air felt heavier, more oppressive, as if the earth itself was closing in around me. And then, just as I thought I couldn't run any longer, the ground shifted beneath me. The road I had been following abruptly gave way to a steep drop. I was falling. I didn't even have time to scream before the ground disappeared completely beneath my feet. I hit the bottom with a sickening thud, my body twisting painfully as I collided with something hard and jagged. Pain exploded through my limbs, but I didn't care. I couldn't care. I had to move. I had to get away. I pushed myself to my knees, my vision blurry and the world spinning. I didn't know where I was, but the air was different here. It wasn't just cold, it was wrong. There was something thick and suffocating about it. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling with exhaustion. The figure was still there, looming just at the top of the drop, staring down at me with its shadowy gaze. But then it was gone. It didn't vanish like the figure from earlier. No, it faded away as though it had never existed. And in its place there was something else. Something worse. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it. Feel it crawling into my mind, filling it with fear and dread. It wasn't just a presence anymore. It was a part of me. I had to leave. But no matter which direction I turned, no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape it. The house had claimed me. And now, whatever was inside, whatever had been awakened, was coming for me. I ran. My lungs burned with every gasp, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs. The pain in my legs was a constant reminder of how much longer I had been running than I thought. I couldn't stop. I couldn't give in. Whatever that thing was that had followed me, whatever was hunting me now, it wasn't just an apparition. It was real, and it wasn't going to stop until it had me. The woods around me felt alive, watching, whispering. I could hear faint rustlings in the branches, like the trees were whispering to one another about me. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming. My head was spinning, the forest around me warping in strange ways, as though it were bending to a force I couldn't see. I stumbled over roots, falling onto the uneven ground, my hands scraping against the earth. The dark was pressing in, every shadow a threat. It wasn't just the darkness of the night anymore, it was something more sinister, something ancient. It was the very air around me that felt wrong. I had crossed some invisible threshold, and now there was no way back. I couldn't think. My mind was clouded with fear, my thoughts fragmented. All I could focus on was the sound. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow but steady, drawing closer, closer. Every step sent a shock of cold through me, making me feel as if my skin was being ripped from my body. I knew I had to keep moving, but my body was giving out. My legs were heavy, my breathing shallow, and my thoughts muddled. It wasn't just the exhaustion. It was the presence, the feeling of something closing in on me. I had to find shelter. Somewhere to hide. Somewhere safe. I glanced around, my eyes desperately searching the trees, but there was nothing. The woods stretched on in every direction, endless and foreboding. But then, through the haze of fear and confusion, I saw it. A figure. A shape in the distance. At first, I thought it was another shadow, another trick of the night, but it wasn't. It was a house. A house. Here. In the middle of the woods? I didn't care. I ran toward it. My mind didn't register what I was doing. I was moving on instinct now. I had to get away. I had to survive. The house was old, its wooden frame sagging beneath the weight of time, its windows dark and empty. It loomed over me, towering like a forgotten monument to something terrible. But it was a refuge. A possible refuge. I reached the front door and tried to push it open, but it was stuck. My hands shook as I pressed harder, the wood creaking and groaning under the pressure. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was just pushing, desperate to get inside. Finally, with one final shove, the door gave way, opening into darkness. I stepped inside, my breath ragged. The air was thick, musty, and old. The smell was suffocating like mildew and decay, but it was better than the woods, better than the things that followed me out there. The door slammed shut behind me and I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. I turned, expecting to see the figure from before, the one that had haunted me throughout the woods, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no movement. Just the oppressive silence. I listened, straining my ears, but all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing, sharp and uneven. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. I turned and stumbled deeper into the house, my footfalls echoing in the vast emptiness. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but I couldn't afford to be quiet. I had to find somewhere to hide, somewhere to escape whatever had followed me. I found a hallway, dimly lit by the faint glow of the moon coming through the cracks in the rotting walls. I moved down it, my mind racing, my senses on high alert. The house was eerily silent, but the air was charged, heavy with something I couldn't place. I reached a room at the end of the hall, a bedroom. It was dark, but there was a faint outline of a bed, and the walls were lined with old, faded wallpaper. I didn't care. I didn't care what was in the room, only that it was somewhere to rest, somewhere to hide. I stepped inside, the door creaking loudly as it swung open. As I crossed the threshold, I froze. The bed wasn't empty. Someone, or something, was sitting there. I couldn't make out its shape, but it was sitting perfectly still, its back turned to me. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, each beat a violent, thunderous thud in the quiet of the room. Slowly the figure turned. The face was obscured by darkness, but the eyes, those eyes, they gleamed, bright and unblinking. Eyes that were cold, lifeless, and filled with malice. They locked onto mine, and I felt a chill wash over me, spreading from my chest to my limbs. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with something suffocating. The figure on the bed moved, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it slowly got up, its movements stiff, like it hadn't moved in years. I backed away, my legs stumbling beneath me as I collided with the wall. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, my body frozen with terror. The figure moved closer, its footsteps slow but deliberate. The closer it got, the colder the air became, until I could feel my breath fogging in front of me. I couldn't think. I couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as it came toward me. And then, in a voice that was low and guttural, it whispered, "Leave." The word was like ice, freezing me in place. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. Leave, before it's too late. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. I was alone. But I wasn't alone. I had to leave. No. But where could I go? What was left? And then I realized there was no escape. I didn't know what I had expected, but it certainly wasn't this. My legs felt like they might give out at any second as I stumbled toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I had been in situations before where I thought I couldn't breathe, but this felt different. My entire body was gripped by terror, something deep and primal, the kind of fear that made every inch of my skin crawl and my mind scream for release. I didn't know what was real anymore. The house, the figure, the whispers, everything blurred together. I could barely remember the journey that had led me here, or the moments before I had stepped into this cursed place. It felt like everything was slipping away from me, like I was standing on the edge of something dark and ancient, and the pull to go deeper was almost unbearable. I reached the door, my hands shaking violently as I grabbed the knob. But it didn't turn. The door was locked, the wood unyielding, cold to the touch, like the house itself was refusing to let me leave. Panic surged through me. I twisted harder, pulling with all my strength, but it was no use. Behind me I heard a sound. A slow, deliberate tapping. Soft at first, but growing louder. I turned my head, my breath catching in my throat. There, at the edge of the room, standing in the shadows, was the figure again. Its shape was vague in the darkness, but its eyes, I could still see them. Those cold, lifeless eyes, glowing in the pitch black. They were locked onto me again, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something else in them. Something more than just malice. Fear. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't like before. It was as if it was waiting for something, as if it wanted me to see that fear in its eyes, wanted me to understand that whatever it was bound to this place just as much as I was. The tapping grew louder, the floorboards creaking in rhythm. It was coming closer. My panic was suffocating. I pulled at the door again, desperation fueling my every movement. The tapping continued, followed by a low, guttural sound, a voice, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. It was coming from somewhere behind me. Leave? The voice wasn't the same as before. This one was deeper, more resonant, like it was coming from the walls themselves. The house seemed to breathe with it, like it was alive in some way I couldn't comprehend. My hands were slick with sweat as I tried the door again. And this time it gave way. I didn't stop to think. I didn't care where I was going. I just ran. My feet barely touched the ground as I tore through the hallway, heading toward what I thought was the front door. But the house, it felt like it was shifting around me. The walls seemed to warp, the very air bending as if the house itself were alive and conscious, playing with me. I reached the front door and for a moment I thought I might be free. But as my hand touched the handle, I heard it again. The whisper. Leave now, or stay forever. It was the same voice, but now there was a new urgency in it. A warning. I threw the door open, stumbling into the night air, but the second my feet hit the ground, I froze. The woods were different now. The trees weren't just trees. The shadows were deeper, stretching longer, like they had moved, like they had rearranged themselves while I was inside. I didn't know what was happening. Everything around me was wrong. The wind had shifted, carrying with it the faintest scent of something burning, something distant, like the woods themselves had been touched by something darker, something unnatural. And then footsteps. Again. But this time they weren't mine. The sound was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate, as if the person, or whatever it was toying with me. I turned, my breath coming in ragged gasps. A shape emerged from the darkness. A man. No, something like a man. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were wide, fixed on me. His clothes were old, worn, and faded, as though he had been wandering for years. I took a step back, my mind reeling. He didn't speak, didn't move, he just stood there, staring at me with those dark eyes. And then I understood. This was him. The man who had lived here before. The one whose presence lingered in every corner, in every creak of the house. The one who had never left. You can't leave, he said, his voice barely audible over the rustling of the leaves. His lips didn't move like a normal person's. They stretched unnaturally as if they were a part of something older, something that shouldn't be. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, my body shaking with the terror that gripped me. I turned to run, but I couldn't move. My feet were frozen to the ground. It was as if the earth itself was holding me in place, forcing me to face this thing, to witness whatever nightmare had been woven into the fabric of this place. The man, if he even was a man, took a step forward. His eyes never left me. You will stay here. Forever, he whispered, and the ground beneath me trembled. I closed my eyes, bracing for whatever was coming. But nothing happened. When I opened my eyes again, he was gone. But the footsteps, those footsteps, they didn't stop. They were still coming. Closer, closer. And the house was waiting for me. The house felt like a living, breathing thing now, its presence pressing against me with every step I took. The night air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the distant sound of those footsteps, relentless and unyielding. They echoed through the trees like a heartbeat. Steady, patient. I should have run. I should have kept running until I was miles away from here, but my legs felt like they were made of stone, too heavy to move, as if the ground itself was trying to keep me rooted in place. My mind screamed for me to go, but my body refused to cooperate. Every time I tried to lift my feet, that strange force, whatever it was, pulled me back. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flicker of movement. A shadow among the trees. Just a glimpse, but it was enough. It was him. The man. The one whose presence had been haunting the house. I didn't know how I knew, but I did. It was as if he had become a part of the very air, the very fabric of this cursed place. Without thinking, I started to move toward him, my legs dragging, my body trembling. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. I could feel them now, like a pulse beneath my skin, like they were being drawn toward me by some unseen force. I reached the edge of the woods, and there, standing in the shadows, was the figure. He wasn't as close as I'd thought. He was standing by the trees, his back turned to me. I could see his shoulders hunched, his posture wrong, unnatural. I should have turned and run. I knew that. But my feet were glued to the earth, like I was being forced to witness this, forced to understand it. I moved closer, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The world around me was unnervingly still, as though time had stopped. When I was a few feet away, he turned. His eyes, those eyes, were the same, empty and hollow. They seemed to bore into me, into my very soul. There was nothing there but an endless void, a darkness that swallowed everything. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and for a moment I thought I might faint. But he didn't speak. He didn't move. It was as though he was waiting for something. And then it hit me. He wasn't the only one. The trees around me were moving, or at least they seemed to be. Their branches stretched and twisted unnaturally, like they were alive, like they were watching me. I turned, my head spinning. The woods had changed. The path I had taken to get here wasn't there anymore. It was gone, swallowed up by the trees. The house was still there too. I could feel it behind me, lurking just beyond the edge of the woods, waiting for me to come back. "You can't leave," the man said again, his voice coming from everywhere, from the trees, the ground, the very air around me. And that's when I realized I had never really left. It wasn't just the house. It was the land, the woods, everything here. It was all part of the same thing, the same curse, the same presence. I felt something shift behind me, something breathing. I didn't dare turn around, but I could feel it. It was getting closer. "I gave you a chance," the man whispered. "Now you belong to it." The footsteps, the ones I had been hearing, stopped. There was only silence, but the air was thick, so thick it felt suffocating. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath ragged. There in the distance, the house loomed, dark and twisted against the night sky. But now it was different. The windows were alive, pulsing with an unnatural light, as if the house itself was breathing, consuming the night. The door was wide open. I didn't understand. I couldn't understand. Everything was pulling me back, pulling me toward the house, toward the darkness that had been waiting for me all along. I wanted to run, to escape. But something deep inside me knew with certainty, that there was nowhere to run to. The man's face twisted into something like a grin. It was wrong. All wrong. His features stretched and shifted, the shadows around him dancing in ways they shouldn't have. "I told you," he said, his voice echoing through the trees, "you will stay here, forever." The ground shook beneath me and the air grew colder, so cold that it burned. My body refused to move, but my mind screamed in terror. I tried to call for help, but my voice caught in my throat, strangled by the weight of fear. And then I saw it. The thing in the doorway. The shape. A figure. Dark and formless, but somehow it was there, watching, waiting. It stepped out from the house, its form shifting in ways I couldn't understand. It was as though it was made of shadows, but the shadows themselves were alive, writhing and twisting as if they had a mind of their own. The air around it was thick with an unnatural presence, and the very earth seemed to shudder in response. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. But I knew one thing. It was waiting for me, and I couldn't run anymore. The world around me seemed to dissolve, slipping into a kind of twilight haze where nothing felt real. The figure standing in the doorway, it wasn't just a shadow. It was something deeper, something older, pulling at the very fabric of reality. The darkness around it was suffocating, like the house itself was alive, feeding on my fear, waiting for me to break. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. It was like I was trapped in my own skin, unable to escape the pull of the house, unable to free myself from whatever dark force had woven its way into my soul. The figure in the doorway moved, or at least it seemed to, though it wasn't walking in any way I could understand. It slid forward in the darkness, a mass of shifting shadows, its shape warping and stretching like it was made of smoke, constantly changing. It was closer now, impossibly close, and I could feel its presence pressing down on me, heavy and suffocating. There were no words, no sounds from it, just a sense of dread, a gnawing emptiness that seemed to consume everything. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the only thing I could think of was that it was hunting me. It was coming for me and there was no escape. I forced my feet to move, to take one step back, then another, my body shaking with fear. But the closer I got to the woods, the further the path seemed to stretch away. It was like the forest itself had grown, swallowing the earth beneath me. The house, that thing in the doorway, was pulling me back. I could feel it in every inch of my skin, the gnawing sense that no matter how far I ran, it would always be right behind me. Behind me, I heard the rustling of leaves, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, steady. It was him again. The man. Or what was left of him. "You can't leave," he said again, his voice slipping into the wind, carried by something cold and cruel. His words were wrapped in the shadows, like they didn't belong in this world. The figure moved again, its shape undulating like it was breathing in time with the air, swelling and contracting, stretching out toward me. My heart hammered in my chest, and I fought the urge to fall to my knees. I could feel its cold gaze on me even without seeing its eyes. Suddenly, the earth beneath my feet shook. It was more than an earthquake. It was as if the ground was being torn apart by something ancient, something that had been buried here for centuries, waiting to awaken. The trees groaned and creaked, their branches twisting in unnatural angles, as though they were reaching for me, pulling me toward the house. I didn't know where to turn. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The house itself, seemed to breathe around me, the dark windows watching, the door wide open as though inviting me back in. I could almost hear it calling my name, whispering through the night, a voice so low and soothing it made my skin crawl. "Come back," it seemed to say. "You're already part of it." I stumbled back, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my mind a swirling mess of fear and confusion. And then, in the distance, I saw it. The old man. His face, pale and twisted, was standing just beyond the trees. He didn't move, just watched me with those lifeless, empty eyes. There was something so wrong about him, something so unnatural, that I couldn't look away. His presence was suffocating, like he was everywhere, surrounding me, his energy pressing in from all sides. He was the house. He was the thing that had anchored this curse to the land. The ritual, the symbols, the strange forces that had twisted everything here, it had all started with him. And now it was calling me to complete it. My legs felt like they were giving way beneath me. The world around me was spinning, warping, everything pulling apart, the edges blurring. But I couldn't let go. I couldn't let the darkness take me, not like this. Not without a fight. I turned toward the trees again, running through the thickening woods, my breath ragged and desperate. Every step I took felt like I was wading through molasses. The shadows seemed to reach out at me, clawing at my skin, pulling me back toward the house. The path was endless now, winding in impossible directions, as though the woods were reshaping themselves, trapping me in a maze of nightmares. I heard the footsteps again, but this time they weren't slow. They were quick, purposeful. And then I felt something else. A hand. Cold and clammy, it closed around my arm, its grip tight, unyielding. I froze, my entire body locking in fear as I turned, expecting to see the old man standing there. But it wasn't him. It was something worse. A face just inches away from mine. A woman's face, gaunt and pale, her eyes wide with terror, as though she had seen something far worse than I could even imagine. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, but no sound came out. She wasn't alive. She couldn't be. Her hands squeezed tighter, pulling me toward her, her fingers digging into my skin, cold as ice. And I knew deep in my bones that whatever she was part of the house. Part of the curse. I struggled, trying to break free, but her grip only tightened, the darkness around me growing thicker, the cold settling into my bones. I couldn't escape. I couldn't run. The house was pulling me in. It was calling me home. And as the woman's cold fingers dug deeper, I realized something with a horrible clarity. It wasn't just the house. It was me. The world began to tilt, spinning like I was caught in a whirlwind of shadows. The woman's grip on my arm was ice cold, the skin of her fingers pressing into me with a force that left bruises, though I could feel nothing but the unbearable chill. Her face was twisted in an expression of terror, but her eyes, those wide, glassy eyes, looked right through me as if I wasn't even there, as if I was just another lost soul trapped in this nightmare. I tried to scream, but the sound was caught in my throat, strangled by the growing sense of dread that wrapped itself around me like a suffocating fog. My chest ached, and every breath felt like it was being ripped from my lungs. I twisted, trying to pull away from her icy grip, but it was no use. It was like my body was frozen, trapped in place by some unseen force. And then I heard it, a low, rumbling growl, deep in the distance. A sound that seemed to come from the very earth beneath me, vibrating through my bones. I didn't have to turn around to know what it was. It was the house, the thing that had been pulling at me from the very beginning. The footsteps behind me had stopped. It wasn't the old man anymore. It was something worse. Something that had been waiting for me all along. I turned, but the woman's grip tightened, dragging me back. The dark shape of the house loomed ahead, the door wide open, a black void that seemed to swallow everything around it. I could hear the wind howling in the distance, but it wasn't natural. It was the sound of something alive, something that had been trapped in the house for years, maybe centuries, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. I heard the whisper again. That voice. It was coming from the house. "You belong here." The words echoed in my mind, wrapping around me like a noose. I wanted to run, to flee, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the ground had turned to quicksand, holding me in place, making it impossible to escape. I could feel the pull of the house, drawing me toward it, dragging me closer with every breath I took. The walls were alive, the windows like eyes watching, waiting. The woman's cold fingers burned into my arm, and I realized something terrible. She wasn't just trying to pull me toward the house. She was trying to drag me inside. Inside. I fought harder now, desperate to break free. I twisted, kicking at her with everything I had, but her grip was unrelenting. The darkness around us seemed to grow thicker, the air colder, pressing in on me from all sides. And then I felt it. The breath. It was cold. So cold it burned against my skin. It wasn't coming from the woman, it was coming from the house. I looked up, and there, standing at the edge of the woods, was the figure. The one that had haunted me from the very beginning. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could describe. It was a shape, a presence that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. It was waiting. I felt the pressure building in my chest as if the entire world was collapsing in on me. I wanted to run, but the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, the woods changing, twisting, turning the path into an endless maze. The house, its black windows staring at me like hungry eyes, seemed to be pulling at the very fabric of reality. The woman's grip on my arm was starting to fade, but I couldn't feel any relief. I was still trapped. The house was still calling me. The figure at the edge of the woods was still there, waiting for me to come back. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. I wanted to tear myself away from it all, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. And then I understood. I was never meant to leave. The house had always been my destiny. From the moment I stepped foot on this land, I had been marked. There was no escaping it. There was no escaping them. The woman, the figure, the footsteps, the whispers, it was all part of it, part of the curse that had been waiting for me. I could hear them now, behind me, in the trees, in the wind, in the very air around me. They were all there watching, waiting. The house was not just a house. It was a prison. A place where souls were bound, trapped, forever. And now I was one of them. I felt the ground give way beneath me as if I were falling, tumbling into the earth. But there was no sound, no impact, only the cold, endless dark. I never heard my scream, but I heard the house. I felt it. It was calling to me. And then nothing. Story 3. When I first saw the house, I was struck by how it seemed to loom over me, even though it wasn't particularly large. It stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, its faded blue paint peeling in long, curling strips. The windows stared out like dull, blind eyes, and the front porch sagged slightly as if the house were tired of standing. It was the kind of place you might expect to see in a black and white photograph, a relic of a time when things were built to last, but they didn't always age gracefully. I had found the listing late at night, scrolling aimlessly through rental sites in my one-bedroom apartment. The divorce had left me with a tight budget, and most of the places in my price range were cramped, soulless boxes with thin walls and flickering fluorescent lights. This house, though, was different. It had character, or so I told myself. 3 bedrooms, a small yard, and rent I could actually afford. It seemed too good to be true. The landlord was eager to get someone in quickly, and when I asked why, he just muttered something about the previous tenant leaving unexpectedly. I didn't press him for details. I wanted to believe I was getting a deal, that maybe the last tenant just found a better place or had to move for work. But even as I signed the lease, there was a knot in my stomach that I couldn't quite explain. Moving day was uneventful, which was a relief. I'd half expected my car to break down or a sudden storm to roll in, something dramatic to mark the start of this new chapter in my life. Instead, it was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you second-guess yourself. The neighborhood was eerily still as I unloaded boxes from the back of my car. A few curtains twitched in the surrounding houses, but no one came out to say hello. I'd always imagined new neighbors offering a warm smile or a quick welcome to the neighborhood, but here, all I got was an unsettling sense of being watched. The house smelled old. Not in a bad way exactly, but like it had been sitting untouched for years. Dust and the faint hint of mildew clung to the air. The hardwood floors creaked with every step as if protesting my intrusion. I told myself it was just the house settling the way old houses do. The first thing I noticed was the cold. Even with the heater running, the air inside felt sharp, like the house was holding onto a chill that went bone deep. I rubbed my hands together and unpacked as quickly as I could, eager to fill the empty rooms with the small pieces of my life. My favorite chair went by the window in the living room, my bookshelves lined the far wall, and my bed, my fortress of solitude, was set up in the largest of the 3 bedrooms upstairs. That first night I barely slept. I chalked it up to the excitement of the move, but in truth, the house didn't let me relax. The floorboards groaned every time I shifted my weight, and I kept hearing faint creaks in the hallway outside my room. Just the house settling, I reminded myself. But at some point I was certain I heard something else, a faint shuffling sound like feet dragging across the floorboards. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, and strained to listen. Silence. After a long moment, I shook my head and laughed softly. "Get it together," I muttered. The sound of my own voice was strangely comforting, though it didn't quite banish the uneasy feeling in my chest. I got up, walked to the door, and peeked into the hallway. It was empty, the dim light from a single bulb casting soft shadows against the walls. Satisfied, I crawled back into bed and eventually drifted off. The next morning, I decided to introduce myself to my closest neighbor. The house directly next door was an odd mirror image of mine, though it looked better cared for. The paint wasn't peeling and the yard had been neatly trimmed. I knocked on the door and waited, glancing around the quiet street as I did. A few moments later, the door opened, and an older woman with short, steel-gray hair peered out at me. Her sharp, blue eyes assessed me quickly before her expression softened into a polite, if guarded, smile. "Hi," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "I just moved into the house next door. Thought I'd come by and introduce myself." "Oh," she said, her voice carrying a slight edge of surprise. "You're in the old Whitaker place?" Yeah," I replied, suddenly feeling awkward. "It's a nice house." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and studied me, as if deciding how much to say. Finally, she smiled again, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's been empty for a while," she said carefully. "People don't tend to stay there long." "Why's that?" I asked, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. She hesitated, glancing over my shoulder toward the house. "Oh, you know how old houses are. Noisy, drafty. Some folks just find it unsettling." Her tone suggested there was more to the story, but I didn't push her. Instead, I nodded and smiled. "Well, I'm hoping to settle in for the long haul." "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Adler," she said. "And you?" "Call me Jess." She nodded, then glanced at her watch. "Well, Jess, if you ever need anything, I'm right next door. Just take care of yourself." I thanked her and headed back to my house, but her words stuck with me. Take care of yourself, it wasn't the kind of thing you said to someone moving in next door. It sounded more like a warning. That night, as I lay in bed, the noises started again. First, the faint creak of the floorboards. Then, the soft sound of shuffling, like someone pacing back and forth just outside my room. My heart thudded in my chest as I turned on the bedside lamp and stared at the door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. Silence. I sat there for what felt like hours, clutching the edge of the blanket, my ears straining for the slightest sound. Finally, I mustered the courage to get up and check the hallway. It was empty, just like the night before. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that my imagination was running wild. But as I turned to head back to bed, I felt a faint rush of cold air brush past me, and I swear I heard a whisper, a low, almost inaudible voice that sent chills racing down my spine. I didn't sleep at all that night. The days blurred together in a haze of unpacking and trying to get settled. I spent most of my time trying to ignore the unease that had settled in my chest. The house was old, yes, but I could deal with that. People didn't live in new houses forever, and the quirks were just part of the charm. At least that's what I kept telling myself. But as much as I tried to push it away, the atmosphere of the house was starting to get to me. Every time I walked down the hallway, I could feel the eyes of the house on me, like it was aware of my presence. The floors creaked underfoot with every step, like the house was groaning in its sleep. And at night, when I lay in bed, I could hear things. Soft thuds. A dragging sound like a chair being pushed across the floor. It was always just enough to make me sit up and listen, heart hammering in my chest, only for it to stop as soon as I mustered the courage to investigate. I'd had enough. I needed answers, even if they were unsettling. I couldn't live like this, constantly on edge. I decided to head to the local library the next afternoon. Mrs. Adler's words from our brief conversation had lingered in my mind. Asterisk, people don't tend to stay there long, asterisk. And I wanted to know why. Maybe the house's history held the key to these strange occurrences. It wasn't just my imagination. Something was off, and I wasn't about to let it control my life. The library was small, tucked away on the edge of town, but it had an old-world charm about it. Wooden shelves stacked with dusty books, the faint smell of aging paper in the air. I walked up to the front desk and approached the librarian, a woman in her late 50s with thin glasses perched on her nose. "Hi, I'm looking for some information on a house," I said, hesitant at first. "It's on Whitaker Street, the one at the end of the cul-de-sac. I think it used to be called the Whitaker Place." The librarian's eyes narrowed just slightly before she looked down at the ledger in front of her. "The Whitaker House," she repeated, almost under her breath. "That place has been around for a long time." She adjusted her glasses, then glanced at me with a sharp, knowing look. "What is it you're hoping to find?" I leaned in a little closer, lowering my voice. "I've been hearing strange things. Noises at night, cold spots. I just want to know about the house's history. Anything unusual that might explain what's going on." She studied me for a moment, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I see. Well, the history of that house isn't exactly a happy one. But it's a long story." "I've got time," I said, trying to sound casual, though my heart was racing in anticipation. She nodded and gestured for me to follow her. We walked through the rows of books, eventually stopping at a section dedicated to the town's history. She pulled a thick, leather-bound book from the shelf and placed it in front of me. "This is a collection of old town records," she said, flipping it open to a yellowed page. "It'll tell you all about the house's past, if you're sure you want to know." I nodded, my fingers brushing the brittle paper as I scanned the page. The entry about the Whitaker house was brief, but the details were chilling. The house had been built in the late 1800s by a man named Henry Whitaker. He was a reclusive figure, known for his eccentricities and obsession with the occult. It was said that he believed in the power of the unseen world, that there were doors between the living and the dead, and that he could open those doors with the right rituals. The house had always had a strange air about it. Local children would dare each other to approach it, but no one ever stayed for long. The most disturbing part of the history was the mention of his disappearance. In the early 1900s, Henry Whitaker had vanished without a trace. The house had remained abandoned for decades after that, with rumors swirling that he had succeeded in opening some kind of portal, a door to something terrible that had claimed him. Some locals claimed to hear strange sounds coming from the house at night, while others swore they saw shadowy figures moving behind the windows. I set the book down slowly, my heart pounding. The history was darker than I'd imagined. But it wasn't just the house's past that unnerved me. It was the sudden realization that I had moved into a place that had been tainted by whatever had happened here all those years ago. I looked up at the librarian who was watching me closely. "Is there more?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded but didn't speak for a moment. Then in a low voice she added, "The house has a curse. That's what people around here say. No one really knows what happened to Whitaker, but after he disappeared, strange things started happening. People who moved in afterwards, well, they never stayed long. Some ran out of the house in the middle of the night, babbling about seeing things. Others heard footsteps following them, or voices when they were alone. And there's something about the attic," she trailed off, her voice faltering. "The attic?" I repeated. She nodded. "No one goes up there. Not anymore. Some say it's the source of the energy, I guess you'd call it. That's where Whitaker did his rituals. Where he opened the door." She looked at me with pity in her eyes. "I wouldn't go up there if I were you." Her warning hung in the air, heavy and ominous. I had already made up my mind. I was going to get to the bottom of this, no matter how terrifying it turned out to be. But the thought of what might be waiting in that attic filled me with dread. I left the library that afternoon, clutching the book to my chest, my mind racing. I didn't know what I was expecting to find in the attic, but I was sure of one thing. Whatever it wasn't going to let me leave easily. That night as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing in the hallway outside my room. This time I didn't wait for it to stop. I threw the covers off and walked to the door, my heart hammering in my chest. As I opened the door, the cold air hit me first. And then the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open, far above me. The attic. I wasn't alone in this house. And whatever was in the attic wasn't waiting for me to come up. It was waiting for me to stay away. The following day, I stood in front of the house, staring up at the attic window. The chill from last night still lingered in my bones, a deep, gnawing cold that I couldn't shake off. My mind kept drifting back to the sounds, the footsteps, the creaking door. The attic had become an obsession, a dark, beckoning space that felt as though it had been waiting for me, or perhaps for anyone who dared to uncover its secrets. I spent the morning pacing through the house, gathering my thoughts, trying to ignore the tension in my chest. It was as if the house was pressing in on me from all sides. Even the sunlight, streaming through the dusty windows, felt muted, as if it couldn't fully reach into the dark corners of the rooms. I had to go up there. I knew it. The attic wasn't just some dusty, forgotten space. It was central to everything that had been happening. There was something in that room, something connected to Henry Whitaker's obsession with the occult. The more I thought about it, the more I felt like the house was alive, and I was being drawn into its web whether I liked it or not. The stairs leading to the attic creaked ominously as I ascended, each step echoing in the silence. I had grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen, and it trembled in my hand as I reached the top. The door to the attic was a heavy, old thing, with a brass handle that looked like it had seen better days. I had half expected it to be locked, but it wasn't. It opened easily, the hinges groaning as if protesting my intrusion. The air up there was thick, musty, and suffocating. Dust swirled in the beam of my flashlight, and the shadows seemed to writhe in the corners of the room. There was an overwhelming sense of neglect, as though no one had set foot in the attic for decades. The wooden beams above were covered in cobwebs, and the floor was littered with old crates, broken furniture, and torn pieces of fabric. I stepped inside, my flashlight scanning the room. Nothing seemed to jump out at me, nothing immediately obvious that could explain the strange occurrences. But something about the atmosphere made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The deeper I went into the attic, the more it felt like the house was watching me, like it was waiting for me to do something, to disturb whatever had been left undisturbed for so long. And then I saw it. Tucked into the far corner of the attic, partially hidden behind a stack of old trunks, was a wooden chest. It was small, nothing special to look at, but the air around it felt colder. The flashlight's beam flickered as I approached it, and for a moment, I thought it might die altogether. But it didn't. I hesitated, my hand hovering above the chest as a strange sensation crept up my spine, a feeling of unease so intense it made my stomach churn. I couldn't leave it there, not after everything that had been happening. I knelt beside the chest, lifting the lid with a creak that echoed in the stillness of the attic. Inside, I found a collection of old, brittle books and papers. At first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but as I sifted through the pages, one book caught my eye. Its cover was faded and cracked, the title barely legible in the dim light. I pulled it out and began flipping through it, the words scribbled in a tight, frantic hand that seemed to tremble with each stroke. It was a journal, a diary to be exact. The pages were filled with ramblings, strange symbols, and references to rituals and ceremonies. The writing became increasingly erratic as I flipped through the book, the words blurring together in my mind. But one phrase stood out, repeated over and over again in different places. Asterisk, the door must remain closed. Asterisk. I stopped reading, my heart racing as I felt the room grow even colder. The journal seemed to warn of something about the door. But what door? The attic? The house itself? I continued reading, my pulse quickening with each sentence. Henry Whitaker had been obsessed with summoning something from beyond the veil. The rituals had begun as harmless experiments, but as the entries progressed, they became darker, more desperate. He wrote about hearing voices at night, seeing things that weren't there, and eventually, seeing them. They're here, one entry read. They know. They can smell fear. The door is open. The final entry was incomprehensible. The handwriting was smeared as if written in a panic. It simply read, asterisk, do not listen to the footsteps. Do not answer the knocking. You will not survive. Asterisk. I slammed the journal shut, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The weight of what I had just read settled over me like a suffocating fog. I had to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, I heard it. The soft sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, like someone walking across the wooden floor. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, and slowly turned around. There was nothing there. I forced myself to move, my legs feeling like lead as I rushed down the stairs. The footsteps followed, almost like a shadow, just behind me, growing louder with every step. The door to the attic creaked shut as if of its own accord, the heavy sound echoing in the silence of the house. I ran. Down the hall, out of the room, through the door, and into the safety of the living room. My chest heaved with panic as I stood there, my mind racing, trying to make sense of everything. But no matter how hard I tried, the feeling of being followed didn't go away. I turned to look toward the hallway, and there it was. The door. The same door that had creaked open the night before, the one I had heard so many times since moving in. It was open again, just a crack, as if inviting me to come closer. But this time I wasn't going near it. I backed away slowly, the dread creeping up my spine, suffocating me. The journal was right. The footsteps, the knocking, was all real. Whatever was in this house, whatever Henry Whitaker had opened, was not done with me yet. And I was starting to wonder if it ever would be. The house felt different now. I couldn't explain it, but everything had changed. It was as if the walls had grown thicker, the air heavier, and the silence more oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint murmur of wind outside, made my skin crawl. I could feel the house pressing in on me, suffocating me with its history, its secrets, and its malevolent presence. I tried to tell myself it was just the shock of what I'd found, Henry Whitaker's journal, his maddening scribbles, and the warning not to listen to the footsteps. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The house had been waiting for me, I was sure of it now. It wanted something from me, and I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it pulling at me, drawing me deeper into its grip. That night, I sat on the couch, trying to distract myself with a book. The words blurred before my eyes, and I couldn't focus. All I could hear were the faint sounds of movement from the attic, the slow, deliberate creaking of the floorboards above me. I thought I was imagining it, but the sound was so consistent, so rhythmic, it was impossible to ignore. I couldn't stand it any longer. I had to go back up. I didn't know why, but something in me compelled me to go. Maybe I needed answers. Maybe I was searching for a way to escape. But I had to face whatever it was in that attic once and for all. I grabbed the flashlight, my hand trembling. The air in the house felt even colder than before, and my breath fogged in front of me. It was nearly midnight, and the house was completely still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The footsteps, the shadows, the whispers in the walls, they were all there just waiting for me to make the wrong move. I climbed the stairs slowly, every step creaking underfoot. The door to the attic was slightly ajar again, just as I had left it. But this time I didn't hesitate. I pushed it open, and the musty, damp air hit me like a wall. The flashlight's beam flickered again, and I cursed under my breath. The damn thing was playing tricks on me, or maybe it was something else in the house, something that didn't want me to see. I walked into the attic, my eyes scanning the room, looking for any sign of movement. The old wooden beams creaked above me, and the floor beneath my feet groaned with each step. I had never been more aware of every sound in the house, every creak, every rustle of fabric. It was as if the very building was alive, breathing, watching. There, in the corner, I saw it. The chest. The one I had found the journal in. But now it was different. It was open. I hadn't opened it. A cold chill ran down my spine as I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. Inside, the journal was gone. But something else was there. A small, old-fashioned mirror. It was tarnished with age, its surface covered in grime, but as I leaned in closer, I could see my reflection staring back at me. Or at least it looked like me. I reached out to touch the mirror, and the instant my fingers brushed the surface, a wave of cold washed over me, and the reflection in the glass shifted. For a split second, I saw someone else standing behind me, tall, dark-haired, their face obscured by shadows. My heart leapt in my chest, and I spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the silence. I backed away from the mirror, my legs shaking, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just seen. It was impossible. It had to be. I turned to leave the attic, but as I did, I heard it. The faint sound of scratching, like fingernails dragging across the floor. I froze, my blood running cold. It was coming from behind me. Slowly, I turned, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and aimed it into the shadows. The beam fell on something, a figure barely visible, crouched on the floor, its back to me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was paralyzed with fear. And then the figure turned its head. Its eyes were dark, hollow, empty pits, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile that seemed to tear at its face. It let out a low, guttural sound, a soft whisper that wasn't a whisper at all. It was a command. Asterisk leave. Asterisk. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. My body was frozen, unable to obey my mind's desperate commands to run, to escape, to do anything. The figure slowly began to rise, its movements jerky and unnatural. The cold in the room intensified, the air thick and suffocating, pressing down on me like a weight. My chest tightened and I gasped for air. Then, as if it had been nothing more than a dream, the figure vanished. The room was empty again, the shadows nothing more than shadows. But I could still feel its presence. It was still there, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. I ran down the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The house had taken something from me, something I wasn't sure I would ever get back. My mind raced, but every thought was drowned out by the relentless pounding of my heart. The door to the attic was closed behind me. I didn't know if I had closed it or if the house had done it for me. Either way, I didn't care. I couldn't stay here anymore. But as I reached the front door, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. It was too late to run. The house had claimed me. I don't remember how I got back to the living room that night. My legs were unsteady, my thoughts tangled, and the fear that had gripped me in the attic refused to let go. It was as though the house had sunk its claws into me, dragging me deeper into its suffocating grasp with every step I took. I should have left. I should have packed up and fled the moment I felt the first stirrings of something wrong. But I didn't. And now it felt like there was no escaping it. The footsteps from upstairs echoed in my mind, louder with each passing minute. They weren't stopping. The rhythmic sound, heavy and purposeful, reverberated through the house. It was almost as if they were mocking me, daring me to acknowledge them, to come face to face with whatever was lurking up there. I wanted to scream, to break the silence that was choking me, but my voice seemed to have abandoned me. The house felt alive, like it was breathing, pulsing with some dark, malevolent energy that I couldn't understand. It was as if the very walls were closing in around me, each creak of the floorboards above a reminder that I was not alone. That thing, whatever it was still here. and it knew I was here too. I tried to distract myself, to find something normal, something comforting in the chaos. I grabbed my phone, scrolling through messages, trying to pretend that I was just a regular person with regular problems. But nothing made sense. Not anymore. Every sound in the house, every flicker of light, every shadow in the corner of my eye was a reminder of what was happening. I couldn't stay here. I knew that now. But where could I go? The idea of walking out into the cold night felt like a desperate, pointless escape. I was trapped, not just by the house, but by the thing that owned it, the thing that had been waiting for someone like me. I had been drawn in just as the previous tenants had been. They had run. They had left, babbling about curses, hearing footsteps, hearing things that weren't there. They had been right. And I wasn't sure if I would make it out like they did. The night dragged on, each second dragging me deeper into the hole of my own dread. I tried to ignore the sounds upstairs, but they grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. It was scratching, like claws dragging across wood, slow and deliberate. It was coming from the attic again, but now it was everywhere, seeping into the walls, into the floorboards, until I could feel it vibrating under my skin. The house was alive. I had no doubt about that anymore. It was alive with something dark, something that had been there long before I ever set foot in it. And now it was waiting for me to make my move. But I didn't know what the right move was anymore. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, the thing in the attic. The twisted figure with its hollow eyes and that horrid smile. And every time I tried to look away, it followed me like a shadow in the corner of my vision. Finally, I couldn't take it any longer. I grabbed my keys, my coat, anything I could find, and I ran for the door. I didn't care if it was the middle of the night. I didn't care if I had nowhere to go. The house was wrong and I needed to get away from it. But as I reached for the door handle, I froze. The footsteps had stopped. The scratching was gone. Everything had gone still. Too still. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence in the house was deafening. I almost expected to hear it again, the faint sound of movement, the whispers in the walls, the scratching at the door. But nothing. Not a sound. I turned around slowly, my hand still on the doorknob, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The attic door. It was wide open. The darkness beyond it was thick and suffocating. But I could see something in the shadows. A figure, barely visible, standing at the top of the stairs. It was tall, thin, and shrouded in darkness, with long, outstretched arms. It was waiting for me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. The figure began to move toward me, slow and deliberate, its footsteps heavy and ominous. Each step it took made the floor tremble, the very foundation of the house shaking with the weight of its presence. I backed away, my body trembling, but I couldn't look away from it. It was real. It was coming for me. The air grew colder, colder than I had ever felt, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. The figure stopped at the bottom of the stairs, just out of reach, but I could feel its gaze on me. I could feel its hunger. And in that moment, I knew, it was not going to let me leave Star. I turned and ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. My feet pounded against the floor as I sprinted toward the door, my mind screaming for escape. The house felt like it was closing in around me, the walls pressing tighter with each step, the air thicker with every breath. I flung open the door and stepped out into the night, gasping for air, my heart still pounding in my chest. But as I stepped onto the porch, I stopped. I was outside. I was free. But the moment I took that first step away from the house, I heard it again. The footsteps. They were behind me. Slow. Steady. Coming for me. I turned, but the house was empty. The door was closed. The windows were dark. But I could feel it, I could hear it, the thing that had followed me that was still in the house. And I knew deep down that it wasn't finished with me. It would never be finished with me. I ran. But I couldn't escape. Not from the house. Not from the thing inside it. Because it was always with me. And it would never let me go. The world outside was colder than I expected. The wind bit through my clothes, sharp and unforgiving, but it didn't matter. I didn't feel the cold, not really. My skin was numb. My heart was still hammering in my chest, my breaths ragged and shallow. I had escaped the house, but somehow I knew deep down that I had never truly left. As I stumbled down the street, my eyes scanning the shadows, every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves, felt like the footsteps I had heard in the house, following me, drawing closer. The night was so quiet, too quiet, but every part of me was on edge, straining to hear something, anything, that would make sense of what had happened. But there was nothing. The silence was absolute. I don't know how long I walked or where I went. My legs moved on their own, the only goal to get as far away from the house as possible, but no matter how far I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still tethered to it. The house, that cursed house, seemed to loom over me like a shadow, stretching into every corner of my mind. I kept seeing it in my mind's eye, the figure in the attic, its hollow eyes, the slow, deliberate movements as it came closer and closer, always just out of reach. It had felt so real, so tangible, like something I could touch. I shuddered at the thought, the cold settling deep into my bones. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that the fear I'd felt was all in my head. But I knew the truth. I could feel it. Something had followed me. Something from the house. I couldn't escape. I don't know how I ended up back at the same street, the one that led to the house, but when I realized where I was, panic flooded through me. I had somehow circled back. The house was there, just down the road, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. The windows were dark, lifeless. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting for me to come back inside. I froze in my tracks. My breath caught in my throat. The footsteps, they were behind me. I could hear them now, soft at first, almost like a whisper, but steadily growing louder. The sound of someone, or something, approaching. I whirled around, but there was no one there. Only the empty street stretching behind me, silent and still. I took a step forward, then another, my mind screaming at me to run, to get away, but my body refused to move. It was as if I was tethered to the ground, stuck in place. I wanted to scream, to call out for help, but there was no one here. No one to hear me. No one who could help. And then I heard it, the sound I dreaded more than anything. A voice. Soft at first, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. Asterisk, come back. Asterisk. I spun around, searching the street, the trees, the shadows. But there was no one. The voice hadn't come from outside. It had come from inside my head. My stomach churned. I knew who it was. I knew what it was. It was the thing from the house. The thing that had been waiting for me. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't stop. I just ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my feet barely touching the ground. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I tried to get, the footsteps never stopped. They were always there, just behind me, never letting me escape. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and with it, a feeling of inevitable doom settled over me. The cold wrapped around me like a vice, and I could barely catch my breath. I was gasping, choking on the fear, but my legs kept moving, my feet pounding against the pavement. But no matter how much distance I put between myself and the house, it was always there, just out of sight, but never out of mind. It was as though the house had marked me, and now I was forever bound to it. And then I saw it. In the distance, up ahead, standing in the middle of the road, was a figure. Dark, tall, and motionless. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath caught in my throat. It was the figure from the attic. The same twisted shape, the same hollow eyes staring out from the shadows. But this time it was real. It was here. It was waiting for me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs refused to move. My body was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what I was seeing. The figure stood there, its dark silhouette blending with the night, the same twisted grin stretching across its face. "You can't leave," it whispered, its voice hollow and chilling. And then, before I could react, it took a step forward. Just one step, but that was enough. The air around me grew colder, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as though the figure's presence was digging into my very soul. The darkness seemed to grow thicker, wrapping around me, smothering me. I stumbled back, my feet unsteady beneath me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The figure was too close now. I could feel it reaching out for me, its icy fingers grazing the air, its presence suffocating. And then it spoke again, louder this time, its voice a twisted, mocking whisper. "Asterisk, you'll never escape." Asterisk. I closed my eyes, my mind screaming for release, for a way out. But it was too late. The darkness was already inside me. The house, the curse, the thing in the attic, they were all part of me now. I was trapped. Trapped in the house, trapped by the thing that had followed me. It would never let me go. And no one would ever hear my screams. I woke up to darkness. At first, it felt like a dream, the kind where everything is blurry and just out of reach. But the feeling in my chest, that familiar weight, was all too real. My breath came in shallow gasps as I pushed myself up, my surroundings eerily quiet. It had been hours, maybe days, how could I tell? The shadows of the house crept around me, its presence suffocating. I was still inside, still trapped, though I didn't remember walking back. My eyes darted around the room, but there was no one there, nothing that could explain how I'd ended up back in that suffocating place. I couldn't even remember how I got back. Had I gone anywhere at all? My body was heavy like I had been pulled through thick mud. It was as though the house itself was weighing me down, its walls pressing closer, suffocating me slowly, one breath at a time. I glanced around the room. The faint glow of the streetlight outside filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the floor. The house, or what was left of it, looked unchanged. It looked as if it had been waiting, patient, biding its time for me to come back. It felt like it knew I would return, like it was expecting me. A chill ran through me. I had been here before I had left, but now everything was different. I sat up on the bed, my hands trembling. My thoughts were still muddled, swirling like the dust in the air. What had happened? What was real? The weight in my chest grew, a growing pressure that pushed against my ribs. The house was never quiet for long, and I could already hear the sound of creaking floorboards from somewhere deep in the house. The sound was unmistakable, slow, deliberate, like someone or something was moving through the house, creeping along the old wooden floors, its presence suffocating, unyielding. I was no longer alone. I felt the air shift behind me, felt the unmistakable brush of cold, ice cold, against my skin. I jerked around, my heart pounding in my chest, but the room was still empty. The shadows clung to the walls like cobwebs, thick and oppressive. I blinked, shaking my head, trying to make sense of it. Nothing. But the cold was real. Was there. It clung to me, sinking into my bones, biting deeper and deeper. I could feel it now, the cold, icy fingers brushing against the back of my neck. A shiver ran down my spine. I turned back to face the bed, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. But there was no denying it. The thing in the house was close now. I could feel it watching me. The air was thick with its presence. I looked around the room, desperate for some kind of escape, but the walls seemed to close in around me. The door was still there, but it felt miles away, unreachable. The shadows seemed to stretch toward me like hands reaching, grasping, pulling me in. My eyes flicked to the window. The street outside was empty. No one was out there. No one could help. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall outside, louder this time. They were heavy, purposeful, and they weren't stopping. My pulse quickened, my thoughts scrambling to find an explanation, but none came. I held my breath, listening. Asterisk step. Step. Step asterisk. It was the same rhythm, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing in the hallway outside. Someone, or something, was coming for me. The air grew colder, the pressure in my chest tightening. I stood up quickly, the room spinning. I was shaking, my body trembling uncontrollably. The footsteps were getting closer. They were right outside my door now, just on the other side of the wood. I could hear the creak of the floorboards beneath each footstep, the faint scraping of something against the wall. I felt it, the weight of it all pressing down on me, forcing the air out of my lungs. The footsteps stopped. I could hear my heartbeat, thumping in my ears, drowning out every other sound. I took a shaky step toward the door. Click. The doorknob turned. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as the door creaked open slowly, agonizingly slow, as though whatever was on the other side was savoring the moment. The room seemed to shrink, the shadows growing longer and darker, swallowing up the walls. The cold intensified, and I felt a gust of wind slip through the crack of the door, brushing past me, icy and biting. I didn't dare move. I couldn't move. My feet felt frozen to the ground. I couldn't take my eyes off the door as it opened, just a crack, just enough for something to step through. But nothing came through. The hallway outside was empty. For a moment I thought I had imagined it. Perhaps it was just the wind, the house settling, playing tricks on my mind. But then I heard it. A whisper. Asterisk, come closer. Asterisk. The voice was cold, hollow, a breathy, rasping whisper that seemed to echo in my ears, reverberating deep inside my skull. It wasn't just a voice. It was inside me like a parasite burrowing into my mind, coaxing me closer, beckoning me toward the door. I stepped back, my heart thundering. The voice didn't stop. Asterisk, you can't run. Asterisk. I turned and ran. I didn't think, I didn't hesitate. I just bolted, my footsteps heavy and clumsy as I rushed toward the stairs. The house was alive, alive in a way I couldn't understand. I felt the cold breath on my neck again, felt something watching me, following me. The house was chasing me. I stumbled down the stairs, my legs weak, my chest tight, as the walls groaned around me. The house was shifting, moving, bending to whatever force was inside. I reached the door, my hand grasping the cold knob, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. I tried again, panic setting in, pulling and twisting at the door, but it wouldn't open. I could feel the thing, whatever it was, getting closer, its presence suffocating, overwhelming. And then the whisper came again, right behind me, cold and mocking. Asterisk, it's already too late. Asterisk. I turned around, my heart stopping in my chest. Standing in the doorway in the shadows was the figure, the one from the attic. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It was real, and it was waiting for me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. It was here. I don't remember how I got out of the house. One moment I was standing there, frozen in terror, the figure looming in the doorway like a dark, endless void, and the next I was outside. My hands were shaking as I stared at the house, my back pressed against the cold, wet ground. The night air felt different, somehow, thicker, heavier, as if the house had somehow spilled itself into the world around me. I could still feel it like a weight in the air. My mind couldn't grasp what had happened. My breath came in jagged, uneven gasps as I tried to make sense of it all, but nothing made sense anymore. The shadows inside that house had shifted somehow, taking on a life of their own. It was as though they were alive, moving, waiting. And whatever it was that had been whispering to me, whatever it was that had been watching me from the darkness, it wasn't done yet. I couldn't go back in. I knew that. I couldn't even think about it. But something in me, some twisted part of my mind, kept pulling me toward it. I could feel the pull even now, as if the house was calling me, beckoning me back. I forced myself to stand, to take a step away from it. My legs wobbled beneath me, but I managed to move, each step feeling heavier than the last. I needed to get out. But when I turned to leave, I saw him. The neighbor. I don't know why I didn't notice him sooner. Maybe it was because I was too focused on the house, or maybe it was because he had been waiting there. He was standing at the edge of the yard, just watching me. His face was shadowed, his figure blending into the night as if he had been there for hours. "Don't," he said, his voice low and steady. I froze. It was like he knew exactly what was happening. He knew exactly what had been happening to me. His eyes never left mine, as if he was waiting for me to acknowledge something unspeakable. Something we both knew was true but couldn't understand. "You should have never moved in," he continued. "You were warned. The house chooses its tenants. It always has." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. The house chooses? What did that even mean? And what had he meant by warned? Who had warned me? I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and finally spoke, my voice trembling. "What do you mean? What happened to the others? The people who lived here before?" He shook his head, the faintest shadow of pity in his eyes. "You're not the first one to think you could escape. You're not the first one who's tried." I took a step closer to him, despite the nagging feeling inside that told me to run. I had to know. I had to hear the truth, even if it broke me. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you warn me before I moved in?" He looked down at the ground, his lips pressed into a tight line. "People move in thinking they can change things. They think they can ignore the house's history. But they're wrong. They're always wrong." His voice dropped to a whisper. "It's in the walls. It's in the air. It never leaves." I felt my heart race. The air around me felt heavier again, thicker. The house, it was in the air. Was he talking about the curse? The whispers. "Who is it?" I managed to ask, though I already knew the answer. Deep down, I knew. The neighbor met my eyes again, and for a moment, I saw something in them. A flicker of fear, of resignation. The one who started it all. The one who opened the door. I felt my blood run cold. The original owner? He nodded, his face pale in the dim light. He was obsessed. He dabbled with things he shouldn't have. Curses, rituals, things meant to stay hidden. He didn't just summon something. He bound it to the house. To the land. He paused, as if weighing whether to continue. But I could see in his eyes that there was no going back. He had seen it too. He had felt it just like I had. Whatever was in there, it's not finished. It's waiting. And it gets what it wants eventually. A chill ran down my spine as I looked back toward the house. The figure was still there, somewhere inside. I could feel it, the oppressive weight of its presence. It was no longer just a haunting. It was a promise. The neighbor stepped back, his eyes never leaving mine. "You have to leave. Now, before it gets you." Before I could even process what he was saying, he turned and disappeared into the shadows. Just like that. Gone. I stared at the house again. My mind was spinning, my body aching with exhaustion, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I couldn't stop myself from walking back toward it, the pull of the house stronger than my fear. I reached the front door. The door that had once been locked, the door that had kept me trapped. But now it was open. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The cold hit me first. It was unbearable, the chill sinking into my skin, crawling through my veins. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to watch me, waiting. And then I heard it again, the footsteps. Heavy, slow, deliberate. They echoed through the halls, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. Something was coming. I had to find a way out. But it was too late. The house had already claimed me. I stumbled forward, my heart thudding in my chest as I moved deeper into the house. The familiar creaks and groans of the old structure seemed louder now, as if the very walls were alive, breathing with the house. Each step I took felt like I was walking on the edge of something, like the floorboards might crack open beneath me at any moment. But the footsteps, those footsteps, were closer now. I tried to ignore them, to pretend they were just the house settling, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. My mind raced, but all I could focus on was the heavy, suffocating air that wrapped around me. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I could feel it, the presence that had been lurking here all along. The house had always been like this, I realized. Always had that eerie quiet, those strange noises at night, those cold drafts that slipped under the door and made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. But now, in the dead of night, with the air thick and oppressive, those quirks seemed to have a meaning. The house wasn't settling. It was waking up. I needed answers. I needed to know what had happened here. Why had the neighbor been so cryptic? What had the original owner really done to curse this place? My eyes were drawn to the staircase, the one I had avoided all this time. The one that had always seemed to lead to nowhere. The shadows at the top of the stairs seemed deeper now, more tangible, as if something was hiding just out of sight. I forced myself to move, my legs shaking beneath me. Each step I took creaked under my weight, echoing through the house like the sound of my own guilt. I wasn't supposed to be here, but there was no going back now. The second floor was just as dark, just as cold. The air was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and something more, rancid. I gagged slightly, covering my nose with the sleeve of my jacket, but the smell seemed to linger in my throat. The hallway stretched out before me, lined with doors that led to rooms I didn't want to see. But one door at the far end of the hall stood out. It was cracked open, as if someone had left it that way on purpose, beckoning me in. I had to go in there. I didn't know why. My feet seemed to move on their own, pulling me forward as though some invisible force was guiding me. The door opened with a low groan, and I stepped inside. The room was small, barely furnished. Just a bed, an old wooden dresser, and a desk piled high with papers and books. But it wasn't the furniture that caught my attention. It was the journal on the desk. It was old, bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed with age. My fingers trembled as I reached for it, the weight of what I was about to discover pressing down on me. As I opened the first page, I felt a cold shiver run up my spine. The writing was messy, almost frantic, as though the author had been desperate to record something. I read the first entry, my heart sinking with every word. I can hear it now, the whispers. They're always there, just out of reach. I don't know what they want, but I can't stop. I have to finish what I started. I know it's dangerous, but it's the only way. The next few pages were filled with similar entries, cryptic, rambling, filled with references to rituals, ancient symbols, and something called the door. There was mention of a dark entity that the original owner had been trying to summon, an entity that had promised him power, knowledge, immortality. But the journal hinted that something had gone wrong, that the door had opened in ways the owner hadn't intended. The last entry was the most chilling. I've seen it now. It's in the house, waiting. It wants something from me. I don't know what it is, but I can feel it getting closer. The door is still open. It's never really closed. And when it's ready, it will come for me. But it won't stop there. It will come for all of us. I slammed the journal shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The air around me seemed to grow even colder, the shadows in the room deepening. I felt something watching me from the corners, from the dark spaces where the light didn't reach. The footsteps were louder now, more distinct, like someone was pacing behind me. I wasn't alone. I didn't know how I knew, but I knew. I could feel the presence moving closer, its cold breath brushing against the back of my neck. My heart pounded in my chest, and my legs felt like they were made of lead. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing. I backed toward the door, my eyes scanning the room frantically. The shadows were stretching, crawling, as though the very walls of the house were alive, breathing, closing in on me. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash, trapping me in the small hallway. My pulse raced. I was locked in. I had to get out. I turned to the staircase, my only way down. But as I reached for the railing, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps from upstairs, getting closer. Whoever, or whatever, was up there was coming for me. I could feel it. I turned and ran, my breath catching in my throat, my footsteps pounding against the floor. The house seemed to bend and twist around me, the walls closing in, the shadows growing thicker. My heart raced, and I could hear my own frantic breathing over the sound of the footsteps, still echoing in the distance. I had to leave. I had to escape before it was too late. But as I reached the front door, I felt the air around me freeze, solidify. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The door wouldn't open. I pounded against it, my hands slick with sweat, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked, sealed from the inside. I screamed, my voice desperate, but it was swallowed up by the house. The footsteps were closer now. I could hear them behind me in the hall at the top of the stairs. It was too late. The house had already claimed me. And now, whatever it was that had been waiting was coming for me. And this time, there was no escaping. I turned, ready to face it, ready to know what was in the darkness. But when I did, there was nothing there. Only the empty, suffocating blackness of the house. I woke up gasping for air, my heart hammering in my chest as though I'd just run a marathon. My mind was a blur, confusion swirling around me like a storm, making it impossible to distinguish dream from reality. The oppressive darkness that had swallowed me whole just moments before was gone, replaced by the dim light of early morning creeping through the drawn curtains. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, as if it was holding its breath. I sat up in bed, my legs shaky and weak, and tried to steady myself. The dream, or was it a nightmare, felt so real, too real. I could still hear the footsteps echoing in my ears, the cold breath on my neck, the door slamming shut. But when I looked around, everything was exactly the same. The room was unchanged, the familiar creaking of the floorboards filling the silence. I forced myself to stand, my feet unsteady beneath me, but my mind refused to let go of the feeling that something was wrong. Something had happened. Had the house claimed me as I had feared? I rubbed my face, trying to shake off the lingering dread, but it stuck to me like a shadow, following my every move. I needed to get out, to leave this place before whatever was haunting it found me again. But part of me, the part that was still tethered to this house, knew I couldn't escape. I wasn't just dealing with a house. I was dealing with something far older, far more dangerous than I could ever comprehend. The journal, that journal, was still on the desk. The same one that had haunted my thoughts ever since I first laid eyes on it. I hadn't wanted to open it again, not after what I had read. But I needed to understand. I had to know what I was up against. I walked over to the desk, my fingers trembling as I touched the weathered leather cover of the journal. The pages felt thick and heavy in my hands, as though they held the weight of the house itself. My stomach churned as I opened it again, scanning the disjointed, frantic writing that filled the pages. But this time, something was different. The words seemed to blur together, shifting and changing as though they were alive, constantly evolving before my eyes. It was as if the journal itself was responding to me, reacting to my presence. My eyes widened, and I quickly flipped through the pages, desperate to find something, anything, that might explain what was happening. That I saw it. The page that had been torn out. The page that was missing. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I had just discovered. The journal wasn't incomplete, it had been deliberately altered. Someone had removed a critical piece of information, a detail that might have explained everything. But who? And why? I slammed the journal shut, feeling a sudden surge of panic. Something was watching me again. The air had grown colder, thicker, as if the very space around me was shifting. It's here. I could feel it. I could feel its presence closing in, creeping into the corners of the room. My eyes darted around, scanning for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the stillness, the eerie quiet that had become all too familiar. The footsteps. They were back. Slow, heavy steps just outside the room. My body froze, my heart skipping a beat. The floorboards creaked under the weight of something that wasn't human, something that didn't belong. I backed away from the desk, my breath coming faster, my palms slick with sweat. I wanted to run, to escape, but I knew deep down that there was nowhere to go. The house was closing in around me, its walls pressing tighter with every passing second. Then the door creaked open, just a fraction, a sliver of darkness staring back at me from the hallway. The footsteps stopped. It's here. I couldn't move, couldn't think. All I could do was watch as the darkness seemed to shift and swirl, as if something, or someone, was standing just beyond the threshold, waiting. The temperature dropped again, and I felt it. The presence. Cold, heavy, suffocating. It was in the room with me now, close enough that I could almost hear it breathing, though there was nothing to see. Nothing but the shadows crawling along the walls like dark tendrils, creeping toward me. I stumbled backward, my legs giving out beneath me, and I fell to the floor. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as panic gripped my chest. I couldn't think, couldn't process what was happening. It was as if my mind had shut down, unable to accept the reality of what I was experiencing. The shadows grew darker, more intense, until I could no longer distinguish where they ended and the room began. It was as if the entire house had become one massive, inescapable void. And then, from the blackness, a voice. Soft at first, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. Asterisk, you shouldn't have come, asterisk. The words sent a jolt of terror through me. I tried to speak, tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth was dry, my throat tight with fear. The voice came again, closer this time, like it was right next to my ear. Asterisk, you've opened the door. Now you'll never leave, asterisk. My body stiffened. My mind screamed for me to get up, to run, to do anything, but my body refused to cooperate. I was paralyzed, locked in place by the unseen force that surrounded me. And then, through the darkness, I felt it, a cold, clammy hand on my shoulder. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. All I could do was wait for whatever was going to happen next. The hand squeezed, slowly, painfully, as the voice whispered again, its breath hot against my ear. Asterisk, it's too late now, asterisk. And with that, the darkness consumed me completely. But before everything went black, I heard something, faint but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps retreating down the hall. It's not over. The thought was the last thing that crossed my mind before I lost consciousness. I woke up to the harsh reality of a nightmare, but this time, there was no mistaking it. I wasn't lying in bed anymore, but sprawled on the cold floor of the room, my body trembling uncontrollably. I pushed myself up, heart racing, breath shallow. The shadows seemed to cling to the corners of the room, lingering like a bad memory. My head was spinning, a dull ache pulsing at my temples. The house felt different now, heavier, suffocating. It wasn't just the chilling air or the unsettling silence that had followed the encounter, it was something deeper, something that seemed to have settled inside me like a poison. I couldn't shake the voice. Asterisk, it's too late now, asterisk. The words echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of what had just happened, what I had just experienced. I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the fog from my thoughts. Was it real? Was I losing my mind? Or had I truly crossed some invisible line, opening a door that could never be closed? The house was eerily still. No more footsteps, no more whispers. Just the soft creaks and groans of an old building settling under its own weight. I stood slowly, my legs weak, as if I had been drained of every ounce of strength. I glanced around the room, feeling a sudden urge to leave, to escape, but there was nowhere to run. The house had me now. I looked at the journal on the desk again, my eyes drawn to it like a magnet. It was almost as if it was calling me, urging me to understand, to uncover the truth. I had to know what was happening. Taking a deep breath, I walked toward the desk. Each step felt like I was walking deeper into the abyss, but I had no choice. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The house had made it clear. I was part of this now. There was no turning back. I flipped through the pages once more, my hands shaking as I searched for something, anything, that would make sense of the chaos that had consumed me. And then I found it. A new page, one that hadn't been there before. The handwriting was frantic, scrawled in a way that looked like it was written in a rush, in a state of fear. Asterisk, I thought it was just a curse. I thought I could get away. But the more I tried to leave, the tighter the grip of the house became. It knows. It knows who I am, what I've done. The rituals, the sacrifices, they weren't enough. The door is open, and it will never close. It will come for me just like it came for the others. I can hear its footsteps behind me. It's coming closer. I can feel its cold breath on my neck. Please, someone, help me. Don't let it find you, asterisk. I stumbled back, the words crashing into me like a wave, my breath caught in my throat. My heart pounded in my chest as the realization hit me like a freight train. The person who had lived here before me, the one who had written this journal, had done the same things I had done. He had opened the door, and now it was coming for me too. The room began to spin again. I could feel my hands grow clammy, my vision narrowing. I turned quickly to look behind me, half expecting to see something lurking in the corner of the room. But there was nothing. Nothing but the oppressive silence. But then, just as quickly as the stillness had settled, I heard it. The softest whisper, a sound so faint it could have been a figment of my imagination. Asterisk, you're next, asterisk. My blood ran cold. I didn't wait to hear anything else. I couldn't. I bolted out of the room, my feet pounding against the floor, the creaks of the house growing louder with every step I took. I rushed through the hallway toward the front door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the doorknob. But the door wouldn't budge. I pulled at the handle with all my strength, panic rising in my chest, but it was as if the house itself was holding me in place, trapping me inside. I could feel it now, its presence closing in around me. It was too late. There was no escape. I turned around, my heart sinking as I looked at the hallway behind me. The darkness seemed to stretch longer, deeper, until it felt like the hallway itself was alive, pulsing with malevolent energy. I could hear something moving, something heavy, something with weight. Footsteps. But they weren't mine. I turned back to the door, the knob slick with sweat beneath my fingers. I slammed my shoulder into it, desperate, crying out as I tried to force it open. But still nothing. The house was holding me here, trapping me with the thing that had followed me. Then suddenly the footsteps stopped. The house fell into an unnatural silence. And then I heard it, the creak of floorboards from upstairs. I froze. My entire body went rigid as I looked up at the staircase. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I could feel the presence, closer now, almost tangible. Something was coming down those stairs, slowly, deliberately. Each creak of the steps was like a countdown to my doom. I couldn't look away. I couldn't run. My legs wouldn't move. The house had me. It was over. And then, from above, I heard a voice that made my blood run cold. Asterisk, you shouldn't have stayed, asterisk. It was the same voice I'd heard before, soft, menacing, like a whisper from the darkest depths of the house. The steps grew louder, closer. I could feel the air growing colder, the temperature dropping like a stone. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, pale and gaunt, emerging from the shadows at the top of the stairs. It wasn't human. It couldn't have been. I didn't wait to see any more. I turned and ran, throwing myself at the door one more time, pushing with every ounce of strength I had left. This time it opened. I stumbled outside, gasping for air, my legs giving out beneath me as I collapsed onto the porch. I didn't care where I was. I didn't care that the night air was cold. I just had to get away. But even as I lay there, breathing heavily, I could hear it. The footsteps moving through the house just behind me, still following. And the whisper. Asterisk, you can't leave, asterisk. I don't know how long I lay there, gasping for breath, my mind racing, my body frozen in terror. The cool night air didn't bring comfort. It felt suffocating, as if the darkness had followed me out, wrapping itself around me like a blanket I couldn't escape. I tried to stand, but my legs trembled beneath me, weak and unsteady. I had to leave, had to get as far away from the house as possible, but every instinct in me screamed that it was too late. The thing inside, the thing that had followed me, had already claimed me. It wasn't just in the house. It was with me now, a shadow that wouldn't let go. But I forced myself to my feet, clinging to whatever strength I had left. The house loomed behind me, dark and oppressive, its windows like empty eyes, watching. I couldn't bring myself to turn around and look at it again. I didn't want to know what was still lurking there, waiting. I stumbled down the path that led away from the house, my heart pounding in my chest. But every step I took felt wrong, like the ground itself was shifting beneath me. The air was thick, heavy with an energy I couldn't understand, something dark that clung to the very fabric of reality. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me, but there was nothing. Just the house. Watching. Always watching. As I walked, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. No, it couldn't be. It was still inside me, still here, still hunting. I turned and looked back toward the house, my heart hammering in my chest, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I saw it. A figure standing in one of the upstairs windows. Pale, gaunt, its eyes black holes in its face, staring at me. I froze, unable to look away. It smiled at me, a twisted, mocking grin that sent a chill through my very soul. Asterisk, you can never leave, asterisk, the voice whispered on the wind, so soft, so haunting, that I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it or if it had come from the thing in the window. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the consequences. I didn't care if I was making a mistake. I just needed to get away. I could feel its presence, the weight of it pressing in on me like it was just behind me, always just behind me, waiting for me to falter. I ran through the dark streets, not knowing where I was going, not caring. All I wanted was distance. All I wanted was to outrun the nightmare that had followed me. But no matter how fast I ran, the footsteps were always there, a constant rhythm in the background, matching my every move. And then I heard something else. A soft laugh. Not the kind of laugh that comes from a person, but something darker, something twisted. A laugh that chilled me to the bone. I looked over my shoulder, but no one was there. I stumbled, my foot catching on something invisible, and I fell hard to the ground. My hands scraped against the rough pavement as I tried to catch myself. And then, as I struggled to push myself up, I saw it again. The figure. Only this time it was closer. Much closer. It was standing at the edge of the street, just at the edge of the light, its face hidden in shadow. But I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the dark. And then it stepped forward and I could see it fully. It was wearing tattered clothes, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes. I couldn't look away from its eyes. They were hollow, black holes that seemed to devour everything in their path, pulling me in, drawing me closer. Asterisk, I told you, asterisk, it whispered, its voice raspy and distant, like it was coming from the depths of the earth. Asterisk, you can never leave, asterisk. I screamed, the sound ripped from my throat as I pushed myself backward, trying to get away, but it was no use. I was frozen, trapped in its gaze, unable to move, unable to breathe. I could feel it coming closer, feel its cold presence wrapping around me, suffocating me. It was the same thing I had seen in the house, the same thing that had haunted my every step, my every thought. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I blinked, my mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. I was still on the ground, my hands shaking violently, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But the figure was gone. The footsteps had stopped. The night was still, but it didn't feel right. The silence was too perfect, too complete. I pushed myself up, my legs unsteady beneath me, and I took a step forward. And then another. I had to leave. I had to get away. But no matter how far I walked, no matter how much time passed, the house was never far from my mind. The thing that had followed me was still there, somewhere, watching, waiting. And as much as I wanted to forget it all, as much as I wanted to move on and leave the horrors behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been inside that house, whatever had haunted me, was still with me, and it would always be with me. The nightmare would never truly end.